I transmigrated into the Primordial World and became the non-existent 13th Ancestral Witch. But honestly, I had zero interest in fighting and killing. All I wanted was to lie low until the underworld was established, so I could go hug Empress Pingxin's thigh and secure my future. At most, I only planned to occasionally give the Ancestral Witches a few ideas. What I never expected was that after they started listening to my advice, these hot-blooded maniacs who used to know nothing but charging in headfirst began pulling one outrageous move after another, so absurd that even the Heavenly Tao started losing its mind. When the great war between the Wu and Demon clans finally arrived, the Wu clan directly announced that all of us were withdrawing from the Primordial World altogether, leaving the Demon clan and the Saints to beat each other to death. Even Hongjun was stunned on the spot. At the foot of Mount Buzhou, inside Pangu Hall, I sat cross-legged above the blood pool, absorbing blood qi and baleful aura. Then the baleful aura suddenly dispersed, revealing my true form. Even though I looked different from the other members of the Wu clan, I was still the genuine 13th Ancestral Witch. The truth was, I was a transmigrator who got sent here by a truck. The moment I opened my eyes, the 12 Ancestral Witches were all standing around me, staring. Just like that, I had somehow become the non-existent 13th Ancestral Witch. While I was still processing that insanity, Zhurong suddenly interrupted my thoughts and said I looked kind of stupid. I hurriedly got to my feet and bowed. But the second I saw Xuanming and Houtu standing there, my eyes nearly popped out. This transmigration was an absolute jackpot. Then Big Brother Dijing asked me what law I controlled. I froze. I didn't have any law power at all. After the Ancestral Witches checked me, they said my origin was incomplete. But then inspiration hit me, and I immediately said this might be Father God Pangu's arrangement, that maybe I had been created to carry all the laws of the Ancestral Witches. The moment I brought out Father God Pangu's name, none of them even dared to argue. Then Sister Houtu suddenly stepped forward, looked at me with a smile, and said, "Then let me test it first." The moment she finished speaking, she directly forced out a drop of essence blood and sent it into my body. I quickly sat down and began refining it. At that exact moment, the inheritance of the 9 Revolutions mysterious art suddenly appeared inside me. Once I started circulating the technique, Houtu's essence blood was absorbed astonishingly fast, and I really did gain control over Houtu's law. When I opened my eyes again, all the Ancestral Witches were staring at me. I grinned and said it felt amazing, and if I could get a few more drops, that would be even better. The Ancestral Witches burst out laughing at once. Big Brother Dijing immediately told Rushu to give me one too. Rushu didn't waste a single word and directly forced out a drop. As I sensed the sharp metal law contained in that essence blood, I couldn't help thinking that this time I had really hit the jackpot. The Ancestral Witches all started urging me at once. Hurry up and refine it. What are you waiting for? I quickly swallowed Rushu's essence blood and started refining it with the 9 Revolutions mysterious art. By the time I opened my eyes again, every single Ancestral Witch was excited out of their mind. Big Brother Dijing slapped my shoulder so hard it almost broke and shouted happily that Father God Pangu finally had a true successor. Then each of them gave me another drop of essence blood. Looking at the 10 glittering drops of essence blood in front of me, I was so moved I nearly cried. After the Ancestral Witches left, I stayed behind in Pangu Hall and cultivated in peace. Later, I once followed them out on a hunt, and I almost got scared to death. When the 12 Ancestral Witches fought, they were like a pack of lunatics. I immediately slipped back into Pangu Hall and went right back to lying low. Then one day, Sister Houtu suddenly told me, "Wuqian, I've cultivated a primordial spirit." I was completely stunned. That was way faster than I had expected. It turned out the suggestion I had given earlier, to let all the Ancestral Witches hand their merit over to Houtu, had actually worked. So that was why she succeeded. As she said that, she smacked my shoulder again and praised me for making a huge contribution this time. I winced in pain. This group of Ancestral Witches really had no concept of holding back. But when I looked at Sister Houtu's newly formed primordial spirit, I felt amazing inside. Maybe, just maybe, the fate of the Wu clan really could be changed. Big Brother Zhurong shoved his way over and asked, "Wutian, do you think I can cultivate a primordial spirit too?" My expression instantly stiffened. How was I supposed to answer that? Sister Houtu succeeded because she was special to begin with, and she had also caught the perfect opportunity. For the others, it probably wouldn't be that easy. Then Big Brother Gonggong grabbed Zhurong and dragged him back. "Keep dreaming." The two of them immediately started arguing again, and Big Brother Dijiang directly threw them out of Pangu Hall. That left only the 5 of us inside. Big Brother Dijiang suddenly asked me, "Who do you think will win in the end among the 3 clans?" I immediately shook my head. None of them. The final winner will be Hongjun. Seeing the shock on Dijiang's face, I secretly felt delighted. Yes, that was exactly it. I needed them to remember just how accurate my predictions were. Then I added in a sly tone, "We can follow behind the 3 clans. They fight and we clean up after them." This wave is free profit. Sister Houtu suddenly asked me whether the three clans would really end up exactly as I said. I smiled and told her to just wait and see. When the time came, I'd only need her to do me a small favor. I wanted the ancestral dragon's essence blood. Sister Houtu agreed without hesitation. The moment she said yes, I felt incredible. Maybe this could even solve the Wu clan's reproduction problem? After that, I continued cultivating. I had already refined 5 drops of ancestral witch essence blood, and the 5 laws were generating and restraining one another inside me. The effect was unbelievably good. Meanwhile, the ancestral witches began taking action. After the 3 clans finished fighting, they rushed in to collect corpses, clear the battlefield, and farm merit like crazy, leaving the 3 clans utterly dumbfounded. Even Hongjun noticed that something felt off about the Wu clan, but no matter how he calculated, he couldn't figure out the reason, so all he could do was become secretly wary. The ancestral witches weren't stupid either. They knew this wasn't the time to clash head-on with the 3 clans. They focused on developing the clan instead, throwing all the corpses from the battlefield into the blood pool. Before long, great witches like Qi Yu and Xingtian were born. Big Brother Dijiang came to me and said I could choose any clansman I wanted to lead, but I immediately refused. Instead, I turned around and went to Sister Houtu. How about the 2 of us work together? The moment I said that, Big Brother Zhurong instantly exploded and yelled that if the 2 of us joined together, we should just produce offspring for the clan while we were at it. The next second, Sister Houtu slapped him straight into the wall, and Sister Xuanming followed up with a kick. With her face slightly red, Sister Houtu agreed to let me help her manage the Houtu tribe. By the time I refined the 10th drop of essence blood, the ancestral witches suddenly came to find me again. Big Brother Dijiang said excitedly, "The 3 clans really have withdrawn from the Primordial World." Sister Houtu handed me 3 drops of ancestral dragon essence blood, though she also gave me a strange glare while doing it. Later, when news came that Hongjun had won, Big Brother Dijiang was completely convinced. He stared at me and said slowly, "Kid, are you actually the Wisdom Ancestral Witch or something?" Of course, when I said I was the Wisdom Ancestral Witch, I had only been joking. Still, seeing how much the Ancestral Witches had begun trusting me made me pretty happy. Then Big Brother Dijiang suddenly asked whether there was anything else I hadn't told them yet. I told him that Hongjun was about to preach the Tao, and that this was a huge opportunity. Because of that, I rushed to refine all the remaining essence blood before Hongjun started preaching. I practically dragged Dijing and Zhu Juyin over to help me. Even though the 2 of them were confused about why I had suddenly become this desperate, they still helped me with everything they had. At last, I refined Dijiang's law of space, and after that, I successfully refined Zhu Juyin's law of time too. But the moment all 12 laws gathered together inside me, the laws in my body suddenly went berserk. The entire Pangu Hall started trembling violently. Sister Houtu rushed over in a panic, and when she saw how much pain I was in, she was so anxious she could barely stand still. Big Brother Dijiang reacted immediately, and together with Zhu Juyin, helped suppress the riot inside me. Then they passed the 12 Heavenly Gods Fiend formation to me and told me to use the formation to harmonize the laws. Just as I was on the verge of cultivating a primordial spirit completely, a streak of purple light suddenly flew out from the depths of Pangu Hall. Big Brother Dijiang cried out, "The primordial measuring heaven ruler?" The primordial measuring heaven ruler suddenly acknowledged me as its master. This was a supreme treasure on the same level as the exquisite pagoda of heaven and earth. It directly entered my body and helped suppress the formation. The 12 laws finally began to fuse together. Behind me, the phantoms of the 12 ancestral witches appeared one by one. And as the formation continued to revolve, those phantoms actually began overlapping into a single figure. Big Brother Zhurong suddenly shouted, "Pangu's true body," and was instantly slapped flying by Dijiang. The other ancestral witches were just as shocked. Even though it was only a faint phantom, it was still Pangu's true body. That meant that in the future, I would be able to use it by myself, without needing the 12 ancestral witches to join forces. My fleshly body and soul both underwent an enormous transformation. All the treasure light around me withdrew inward, while gray law marks were carved into my soul, releasing an undying aura. I had already refined most of the primordial measuring heaven ruler. Unfortunately, the phantom of Pangu's true body was still too faint. Otherwise, I could have refined the whole treasure in one go. The moment I opened my eyes, the ancestral witches immediately surrounded me. Big Brother Dijiang urgently asked whether I had really cultivated Pangu's true body. It was obvious that the sight just now had completely shaken all of them. I explained that this was a divine ability called Pangu True Body, and that I could burn essence blood to transform for a short time. It wasn't equal to the real Pangu True Body, but it was still a terrifying trump card. The ancestral witches were overjoyed after hearing that. Feeling full of confidence, I looked at Sister Xuanming and took the initiative to ask for a spar. But the moment I said that, she attacked without warning and blasted me straight into the air. I hurriedly activated my Pangu True Body divine ability and shouted as I transformed. A flash of divine light burst out, and my aura exploded upward. Sister Xuanming was actually forced back and her face filled with shock. I seized the opening and threw a punch that shattered her defense and forced her back again and again. For once, I had finally gotten to vent my frustration. Trying to act relaxed, I said, "Let's stop here for today." I should leave Sister Xuanming a little face, but she saw right through me instantly. Xuanming gave me a cold laugh. "That little bit of Pangatru body power of yours can't last long, can it?" Then she charged up and started beating me again. I immediately pulled out the primordial measuring heaven ruler as a threat, and only then did Big Brother Dijiang finally tell us to stop. I ended up bruised and battered anyway, while Big Brother Zhurong stood there cheering and saying I finally looked a little more like a real ancestral witch. After they all left, Sister Houtu looked at me worriedly and asked, "Do you think the Wu clan will suffer a great calamity in the future?" I stayed silent for a moment. After hesitating, I decided to tell them the truth. I said that the Dragon, Phoenix, and Keelan clans had all been overwhelmingly powerful too, and yet they still withdrew from the Primordial World in the end. The Wu clan might be flourishing now, but prosperity inevitably leads to decline. That was the law of all things. Sister Xuanming immediately argued back, saying that we were born from Pangu's blood, so how could we possibly be compared to the three clans? I simply asked in return whether the ancestral dragon wasn't also transformed from Pangu's essence. After Houtu and Xuanming left, I continued cultivating in Pangu Hall. My primordial spirit had already formed, but my realm was strange. For ordinary Great Luo Golden Immortals, reaching perfection in one law was enough. But for me, I had to carve 12 laws into myself. The difficulty was many times greater than theirs, but my strength was also much greater. Then I took out the 3 drops of ancestral dragon essence blood, and began refining the water and wood laws within them. I discovered that each time I refined a law, the corresponding ancestral witch rune would appear. After I finished refining them, the Pangu mark inside me became even clearer. Now I could throw 3 punches with that power, which was a lot stronger than before. The ancestral witches truly were heaven-favored beings. Each of them was born controlling a single law, and cultivating came naturally to them. Meanwhile, I had to painstakingly carve all 12 laws by hand. At the same time, Dijiang and Zhu Juyin were discussing whether my claim that the primordial world could not tolerate the Wu clan was actually reliable. Zhu Juyin said that although he didn't want to believe it, I had never once spoken empty words, so they should prepare according to what I said. Right then, Hongjun's voice spread throughout the entire primordial world, announcing that he would preach at the Purple Dawn Palace in 3,000 years. The ancestral witches were stunned. Big Brother Dijiang sighed and said that once again, I had been right. He immediately called the others together to discuss things with me. Hongjun's voice spread across the primordial world, but it couldn't enter Pangu Hall. The moment I woke up and heard that the preaching had been announced, I became anxious and insisted that we leave immediately. Big Brother Gonggong said there were still 3,000 years left, so what was the rush? Big Brother Dijiang controlled the law of space, and when it came to traveling, nobody in the world was faster than us. We would definitely arrive first. When the way ahead opened, the palace gave off a faint treasure light, and there wasn't a single person around. Big Brother Dijiang said proudly, "See? I told you we'd be the fastest." But the very moment he finished speaking, the 3 pure ones suddenly shot out from the side. They were unbelievably fast and passed us in the blink of an eye. Right after that, Fuxi and Nua arrived too, and they passed us just as easily. Big Brother Dijiang was instantly enraged. He immediately realized we were being targeted. Our speed was getting slower and slower. It was obvious that Hongjun was interfering behind the scenes. Inside the Purple Dawn Palace, Hongjun himself was confused too. The heavenly secrets had clearly shown that only 2 ancestral witches would come, so why had all 12 arrived? He secretly moved to block us, afraid that the ancestral witches would seize the seats and ruin his plan. Hongjun had only recently become a saint, so his control over the heavenly Tao was not yet perfect. The moment he saw the ancestral witches appear ahead of schedule, doubt rose in his heart. Had his deduction been wrong? Impossible. He had calculated the heavenly secrets over and over again. In the end, Hongjun had no choice but to forcibly interfere. He mobilized the power of the heavenly Tao to suppress our speed so that the 3 pure ones and Fuxi and Nuwa could enter the Purple Dawn Palace first. He knew this wasn't proper. The ancestral witches had terrible tempers, and if they caused a scene, things could get ugly fast. Besides, this was still the era when the Wu clan's fortune was flourishing. He couldn't exactly go and kill us outright, but if he did nothing and let the ancestral witches grab all the seats, then all his arrangements would collapse. Hongjun silently shook his head. The 3 pure ones were the authentic lineage of Pangu and carried immense fortune. He had to take them as disciples and borrow their destiny to help himself reach an even higher realm. Nua was the same. She too had a great opportunity waiting for her in the future and possessed immense fortune, so naturally she couldn't be missed either. After weighing everything, Hongjun chose to act decisively. Then he warily looked toward the ancestral witches, only to discover something surprising. After being furious for a brief moment, they actually restrained themselves. What was going on? Since when had the ancestral witches become this reasonable? The reason Dijang and the others didn't explode on the spot was because I had persuaded them beforehand. Even so, Dijang was still furious. Instead of cursing Hongjun directly, he shouted loudly, "Brothers, do it!" The aura of the ancestral witches burst out all at once. Vast power surged from them, and the violent might of their laws was completely different from the gentle traces they had allowed me to comprehend before. This time, they were holding absolutely nothing back. With a thunderous boom, the sphere of light surrounding the ancestral witches blazed with brilliance and slammed against the power of the Purple Dawn Palace. The surrounding laws instantly fell into chaos. The ancestral witches were forcibly breaking through the restraint and accelerating toward the palace. I let out a breath of relief. At least I had managed to stop them from erupting directly on Hongjun's turf. If they really started a full fight here, who knew whether Hongjun would use the ancestral witches to establish his authority? But just as that thought crossed my mind, several figures flashed past the ancestral witches. The ones I saw were Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun. The lone figure with an arrogant expression was Kunping. As Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun passed us, they even turned back and smiled politely at the ancestral witches. Their personalities had always been gentle and friendly. Even they were secretly wondering what was going on. It was strange. Ever since entering this place, circulating their mana had become easier and smoother. So why did the ancestral witches look like they were struggling so hard? What they didn't know was that the ancestral witches were being suppressed by the Purple Dawn Palace, while the two of them were secretly receiving Hongjun's hidden assistance. Watching those three figures disappear into the palace, I was stunned, speechless. Inside, I couldn't help cursing. Seriously? Shameless. We got here first, and at the last second, Hongjun pulls something like this? So this was the so-called bearing of the Tao ancestor? In my memory, even if Hongjun interfered, he should have done it in a way that left no trace. Who would have thought he'd be this blatant? This move was rough as hell. The truth was, Hongjun was helpless too. He had originally arranged everything perfectly, but the ancestral witches showing up ahead of time completely wrecked the plan. If he didn't interfere now, the trouble later would only be worse. So who had time to care about appearances? He kept staring at the ancestral witches. What exactly was going on with them? Had some variable appeared? His gaze swept over all of them before finally landing on me, but even then he couldn't see through anything. I had a merit treasure suppressing my heavenly secrets, so even Hongjun couldn't casually probe my background. When the ancestral witches finally entered the Purple Dawn Palace, the three pure ones were already seated on the first three cushions in the front row. But unlike what I had expected, there weren't 6 cushions in the palace. There were actually 7. Behind the 3 pure ones sat Fuxi and Nua. Fuxi possessed great wisdom, so after thinking briefly, he gave up his own seat. Instead, he sat behind Nua and secretly transmitted his voice to her. If this truly was a great opportunity, then many people would fight over it. There were still 12 ancestral witches outside, along with countless great powers. With the strength of just the 2 of them, they could probably only protect 1 seat. So he would stay behind Nua and guard her. That meant the 2 of them only occupied 1 seat. After that, Zhen Yuanzi, Hongyun, and Kunping sat on the 5th and 6th seats. Just like Fuxi, Zhen Yuanzi sat behind Hongyun instead of taking the 7th cushion. I nudged Sister Houtu and said, "You've cultivated a primordial spirit, so you should go sit there." The ancestral witches had no objection, but Houtu froze for a moment and looked at me, her eyes clearly asking, "Don't you have a primordial spirit too? Why aren't you going?" She still remembered that I had been in such a rush to come to the Purple Dawn Palace precisely because the front row seats represented a tremendous opportunity. I just smiled, pressed Houtu down onto the 7th cushion, then turned back to the ancestral witches and said, "Let's sit in the back." With a wave of my hand, I produced a row of jade cushions. Big brother Dijeng was furious. If Hongjun hadn't interfered, all 7 of these seats should have belonged to our Wu clan. How could we end up with only 1? Before he could say anything more, I secretly transmitted my voice and pointed toward Hongyun and Kunpeng's backs with a smile. "Brothers, don't worry. In a little while, Hongyun will give his seat away to us. Not only that, he'll even thank the Wu clan and owe us a karmic favor. Do you believe me?" At that instant, all the ancestral witches' attention was diverted. They were so intrigued they even forgot to be angry. Hearing me say that, all of them turned to stare at Hongyun, their expressions so strange it was as if they were asking whether he was an idiot. But I knew very well that while Hongyun and Zhen Yuanzi were publicly known as good people, they were absolutely not fools. Hongyun aside, Zhen Yuanzi would later become the ancestor of Earth Immortals, an innate spirit root on the same level as Yangmei Daxian. He held the Earth Book and could even lay down the moral kidnapping formation. There was no way someone like that lacked great wisdom. What confirmed my guess even more was the fact that Zhen Yuanzi had given up the final cushion just like Fuxi had and was instead guarding Hongyun from behind. That clearly showed he understood the importance of the cushions and knew that conflict would arise over the preaching seats. So if Hongyun gave up his seat later, it might not just be because he was a nice guy. There might be another reason entirely. At that moment, more than a dozen gazes landed directly on the two of them. The ancestral witch's stares were far too direct, and both Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun immediately felt the pressure. Hongyun's expression stiffened a little, but he still turned around smiling and nodded politely toward the ancestral witches first, before hurriedly looking at Zhen Yuanzi. Brother Zhen Yuanzi, what do the ancestral witches want? They're staring so directly it's making my scalp go numb. They're not planning to attack us, are they? Zhen Yuanzi looked just as confused. I don't know either. But this is the Purple Dawn Palace. The ancestral witches should at least give Hongjun some face, right? Besides, we haven't offended them. After thinking it over for a while, Zhen Yuanzi finally couldn't help looking toward the ancestral witches. His gaze settled on me. After steadying himself, he smiled and asked, "This fellow Taoist looks unfamiliar. May I ask your name?" I had been giving Di Jiang and the others looks with my eyes, but their blunt stares had left me speechless. Seriously, how could they look at people like that? They had scared them half to death. Di Jiang snorted softly and withdrew his blazing gaze, then lowered his head and started talking with Zhu Juyin while secretly pricking up his ears to listen to our conversation. Then they heard me smile and say, "It's normal that fellow Taoist Zhen Yuanzi hasn't seen me before. I rarely walk around the primordial world, but I've heard the names of you two for a long time now. People everywhere say, the two of you are among the rare, true good people in the primordial world." Hearing the goodwill in my tone, both Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun visibly relaxed and their smiles became much more natural. Even though the phrase good people sounded a little strange, my expression was sincere enough that they just assumed they were overthinking it. Zhen Yuanzi modestly shook his head. "You flatter us, fellow Taoist. The ancestral witches praise us too highly. My brother and I simply dislike fighting and only seek freedom. How could we be called good people?" While we were speaking quietly, the three pure ones and Fuxi and Nuwa all looked over curiously. They were puzzled too. Naturally, they knew about the 12 Ancestral Witches. During the Dragon Hand Great Tribulation, everyone had been shocked to see the Ancestral Witches run to the battlefields of the three clans and shamelessly loot corpses while acting perfectly justified about it. The entire primordial world had nearly lost its mind from watching it. But as for me, Wuqian, I was like someone who had appeared out of thin air. I had never shown up anywhere in the primordial world before. And when they saw the attitude the Ancestral Witches had toward me, they became even more surprised. After hearing me reveal my name, everyone's eyes flickered. So his name is Wutian. Most of them assumed I was simply the strongest and most trusted great witch beneath the Ancestral Witches, and that because coming to hear the Tao was such a rare opportunity, the Ancestral Witches had brought me along. Only Hongjun still felt uneasy. Even though he hadn't shown himself, the entire Purple Dawn Palace was under his control. The moment he heard my name, a knot formed in his heart. Wutian. Of all possible names, why did it have to be Wutian? It gave him a faint feeling of direct opposition. Combined with the current behavior of the Wu clan, his mood darkened even more. He definitely didn't believe I was just some ordinary great witch. If he hadn't been afraid of provoking the Ancestral Witches again, he probably would have already mobilized the power of the Heavenly Tao to investigate me thoroughly. While everyone's thoughts were running wild, I continued chatting warmly with Zhen Yuanzi. I didn't have any hostility toward the two of them. In fact, I was pretty interested in them. I had thought about it long ago. While the Ancestral Witches charged around fighting and killing in the front, I could work on building relationships in the back. Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun were both absolutely worth befriending. My words were full of goodwill, and seeing that, both of them also started wanting to make friends with me. The atmosphere clicked immediately, and the more we talked, the more energetic the conversation became. After talking for a while, even Hongyun couldn't help joining in. He turned around with a smile and said, "Fellow Taoist Wutian, after the preaching ends, you must come visit the Five Manor Temple. Brother Zhen Yuanzi's ginseng fruits are absolutely delicious. You have to try them." Hongyun was using the ginseng fruits to build rapport, and Zhen Yuanzi didn't get angry at all. He only shot him a glance and smiled as well. If fellow Taoist comes, Zhen Yuanzi will definitely sweep the couch and welcome you properly. The more harmoniously I spoke with Zhen Yuanzi, the happier I felt. I laughed out loud and said, "Then I'm taking you up on that. I've heard about the ginseng fruits for a long time already, and I've been curious about them for ages." Hearing our conversation, Dijiang and the other ancestral witches blinked in confusion. Weren't we supposed to be talking about the seats? How did this suddenly turn into ginseng fruits? And right at that moment, a crisp sound rang out. The conversation between the three of us was instantly cut off. Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun's smiles froze on their faces, and I frowned too. Before I could even react, the 12 ancestral witches all turned at once. 24 eyes locked directly onto the middle of the three pure ones and landed on Yuanshi Tianzun. Every single one of them wore an unfriendly expression. In an instant, the ancestral witch's attention was completely drawn away as they all stared at Yuanshi. Dijiang directly shouted, "Yuanshi!" let out a cold snort. That snort wasn't aimed only at me. It was also directed at Zhen Yuanzi and Hongjun. The two of them exchanged a glance, then silently looked toward the three pure ones. Sure enough, Taiking, Yuanshi, and Tongtian all had dark expressions on their faces. Yuanshi opened his mouth and said, "I came here to hear the Tao." The moment he started speaking, his face shifted between green and pale, and he looked like he was about to stand up. But Taiking calmly said one sentence first. "Second, brother, this is a saint's dojo." The unspoken meaning was obvious. Don't make trouble here, and give Hongjun some face. I couldn't listen anymore, so I smiled and spoke up. "Fellow Taoist Yuanshi, we came here to make connections and exchange friendship. That's part of the meaning of hearing the Tao, too. But the moment you open your mouth, you start throwing accusations around. If anyone is stirring up trouble here, it's you." Yuanshi choked on the spot. Taiking's gaze sharpened slightly, and even Tongtian muttered under his breath, as if he felt I had a point. Dijiang immediately burst out laughing and slapped my shoulder. "Well said." Zhurong raised a brow and sat down again. "Our Wu clan has always been the most reasonable." I turned back and smiled at the ancestral witches, signaling for them not to blow up. Then I looked at Yuanshi again and added gently, like I was kindly trying to help while stabbing him one more time, "For Father God Pengu's sake, let me advise you not to rely on your so-called orthodox identity and act like you're above everyone else." Yuanshi almost coughed up blood right there. Everyone around us wore strange expressions, but not a single person dared to interrupt. Then I added one more line. "And honestly, it's only because Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun are broad-minded. If it were anyone else, this wouldn't be over so easily." The second I said that, Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun's faces both went green. Their eyes practically begged me, saying, "Please don't drag us into this." But the three pure ones weren't even looking at them anymore. They were staring only at me. Taiking reached out and stopped Yuanshi, transmitting his voice to him in secret, telling him not to act rashly. They had come here to hear the Tao. There was no need to create extra trouble. I shrugged, then used my divine sense to transmit my voice to Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun. "You two don't need to be afraid. Karma isn't something you can avoid just because you want to." Hongyun's seat is a perfect example. I paused slightly after saying that, and the two of them immediately looked at me. Hongyun couldn't help asking, "Fellow Taoist Wutian, are you saying there's something wrong with this cushion?" I didn't answer directly. Instead, I turned and looked toward the back of the Purple Dawn Palace. By now, quite a few people had already arrived. All the front seats were taken, so those who came later either had to sit on the ground or bring out their own cushions. But anyone with status and strength had their eyes fixed on the front row, their gazes gleaming. The moment I looked around, I understood. So, these are Dijun and Taiyi. The golden robes they wore carried the imprint of the sun star. The one with the more regal and imposing aura had to be Dijun. The one beside him, more overbearing with the chaos bell hanging at his waist, was definitely Taiyi. In the future, those two would unite the myriad races and establish the Demon Clan, eventually becoming the Wu clan's greatest enemies. I couldn't help but give them a few extra looks. Dijun and Taiyi both sensed my gaze. Dijun smiled lightly and nodded to me while Taiyi frowned. I nodded back, then shifted my gaze elsewhere. The one covered in blood-soaked murderous aura had to be Mingyi Patriarch. His eyes were darting non-stop as he kept scanning the people seated on the front cushions, not bothering to hide the greed in his eyes at all. Then there were Dong Wanggong, Shi Wangmu, and several other figures I didn't immediately recognize. None of them dared mess with the three pure ones, and with the ancestral witches present in full force, they didn't dare provoke us either. So all their attention was focused on Nuwa, Hongyun, and Kunpeng. Fuxi's expression darkened slightly, and in his heart, he had clearly already made up his mind. No one was going to snatch his sister's opportunity unless they stepped over his corpse first. That resolve in him made quite a few gazes retreat. In the end, even more people turned their eyes toward Hongyun and Kunpeng instead. Hongyun at least still had Zhen Yuanzi behind him. But Kunpeng was all alone. Ever since entering the hall, he had kept his head lowered in silence and hadn't even looked in our direction. So out of everyone there, the pressure on Kunpeng was the greatest. Only then did I withdraw my gaze and send another voice transmission to Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun, smiling as I spoke. So many people have come to the Purple Dawn Palace, yet there are only 7 cushions in the front row. Anyone with a brain can guess that these cushions represent a major opportunity, right? Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun both nodded. Of course they knew people were eyeing them. That was exactly why the two of them had chosen to occupy only one seat. Zhen Yuanzi gave a bitter smile. Maybe their reputation as nice guys just wasn't intimidating enough. In truth, even with him protecting Hongyun, the The number of people staring at Hongjun wasn't any less than the number staring at Kunpeng. He even suspected that if everyone hadn't been wary of me and the Wu clan, someone might have already stepped forward to pressure them. Zhen Yuanzi and Hongjun both sighed softly. They had already understood what I meant. Hongjun gave Zhen Yuanzi a look, as if to say, why not just give the seat to fellow Taoist Wutian and avoid this karmic mess altogether? Up to now, the two of them only knew the seat represented an opportunity. They still had no idea that this opportunity was actually the chance to become a saint. Because of that, they didn't want to stir up trouble over an unknown opportunity. Hongjun sighed inwardly. All he really wanted was to wander freely with brother Zhen Yuanzi, eat ginseng fruits, and discuss the Tao in peace. He quietly transmitted his voice to me. Fellow Taoist Wutian, why don't I give this seat to you? Your Wu clan has many people and great momentum. With the Wu clan watching from outside, no one would dare snatch it. As he said that, he was already preparing to stand. The moment I saw that, I immediately reached out and pressed him back down with a gentle force. I was secretly a little surprised too. Just as I had expected, they really didn't want to cause trouble over an unknown opportunity. So that was how the original course of fate worked. Hongjun gave up his seat to Jian and Junti, lost his primordial violet chi, and even dragged Kunpeng into it. Clearly, the ones who forced Kunpeng were Jian and Junti, and the one who humiliated Kunpeng was Yuanxi. But in the end, the person Kunpeng hated most was Hongjun. Makes sense, honestly. If he couldn't beat them, could he not at least take it out on you, Hongjun? I quickly advised him, fellow Taoist Hongjun, don't rush. This seat is an opportunity, but it also consumes your own fortune and karmic source. The greater the opportunity, the greater the cost. Since you already sat down, giving it away now would be inappropriate instead. If heaven gives you something and you refuse it, that can bring disaster instead. Hongjun was the first cloud born between heaven and earth, and he had even inherited a trace of the blood essence from Pangu's heart. His luck and destiny were exceptionally strong, which was exactly why he was able to obtain this seat. But if he gave it away once here, then later, if the final strand of primordial violet chi still landed in his hands, that would mean he had consumed the fortune of becoming a saint twice over. If someone burned through luck like that and still didn't die, then who would? Hongjun intended to yield the seat, but I had no desire to accept it right now. In fact, I genuinely hoped he would hold his ground. So I continued, if you ask me, you too should learn from our Wu clan. If anyone dares to force you, just fight them with everything you've got. In the entire primordial world right now, there are almost no people who could kill you without paying a terrible price themselves. Hongjun fell silent. Zhen Yuanzi also sank into thought. The two of them weren't naturally combative people, so asking them to make up their minds and risk their lives really was difficult. After a long moment, they both looked at me with gratitude and thanked me for the advice. Dijang had been watching us the whole time. Even though he couldn't hear the voice transmissions, he had already figured out what happened the moment he saw Hongjun trying to stand and me stopping him. Shock flashed through his eyes. Hongjun really wanted to give up the seat, and he was even showing Wutian that kind of gratitude. But then why did Wutian refuse it? Dijang quietly tugged my arm and sent me a voice transmission. Wutian, why didn't you accept it? At this point, Dijang was completely convinced by me. Hongjun really had been about to give up his seat, and the grateful, slightly guilty look in his eyes was exactly what I had predicted earlier. What Dijang didn't know was that the trace of guilt in Hongyun's eyes came from the fact that if he handed me the seat, he would effectively be passing the karmic burden onto the Wu clan. That was why he looked like that. And because of that, Dijang became even more confused. Everything had happened exactly as I said it would, but right at the final moment, I was the one who refused. Earlier, I had been the one urging the ancestral witches to hurry here. Then, after all the chaos outside the Purple Dawn Palace, Dijang naturally assumed that the seat was what I had been planning for from the very beginning. Before I wanted it so badly and now I was pushing it away. What exactly was I trying to do? Facing Dijang's confusion, I just smiled and transmitted my voice back. Brother, don't worry. Just wait a little longer. Just as I had thought before, I truly hoped Hongjun could withstand the pressure and refuse to yield. If that happened, then the grand tide of the primordial world could actually change. Maybe there really could be one more saint named Hongjun. And as long as the great should change, that would benefit the Wu clan. But even if Hongjun couldn't endure the pressure, I still couldn't accept the seat right now. This was primordial violet chi. If I directly took it now, then after Hongjun's third sermon, would Hongjun and Zhen Yuanzi resent me? Would they think I had just scared him with wild claims until he gave up the seat? So even if I wanted that place, now was not the moment. I had to wait until Jian and Junti arrived, until Hongjun was under the greatest pressure, and only then would I step forward, take the seat, and bear that pressure myself. That way, even if they later found out what the seat really represented, they wouldn't blame me. If they blamed anyone, it would be Jian and Junti. After all, I would be the one helping them. The real question was this. If I truly took Hongyun's seat, Would Hongjun still distribute the primordial violet chi according to the original course of fate? Back outside the Purple Dawn Palace, when the ancestral witches were blocked, I had already realized something. Hongjun was not nearly as detached as I had imagined, and this whole order of seats in the Purple Dawn Palace was not just some accidental result of heavenly secrets either. It was something Hongjun had been arranging from the shadows. If I took Hongyun's seat, then I would once again be disrupting Hongjun's plan. Would he really sit there and do nothing? After thinking about it for a moment, I smiled freely to myself. It doesn't matter. I wasn't planning to refine primordial violet chi and sever the 3 corpses to become a saint anyway. Even if I couldn't obtain it in the end, so what? As long as I could verify certain things, that alone would already be my biggest gain. I stopped overthinking it. After hearing my explanation, Dijong still had doubts, but he didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he simply nodded at me with trust and quietly transmitted his voice. All right, your brothers and sisters all trust you. Just do whatever you need to do. We'll back you up. I want to see who still dares target you. After saying that, he shot Yuanshi Tianzun a vicious glare. Yuanshi frowned, and Tai King once again transmitted his voice to him. The sermon is about to begin. Endure it a little longer. Don't create unnecessary trouble. Yuanshi could only force his anger back down. At this stage, the 3 pure ones were actually very united and low profile. They had already taken form at the time of creation. Yet during the Dragon Han Great Tribulation, they had barely shown themselves at all, hiding in Kunlun Mountain to cultivate. Even before becoming saints, they rarely moved around the primordial world. If we were talking about true stability, the 3 pure ones were the real masters of lying low. Time continued to pass. One figure after another flew out of the chaos and entered the Purple Dawn Palace. Yet the palace itself seemed to expand automatically, remaining spacious no matter how many people arrived. Every single person who entered looked first toward the 7 in the front row, and the more people that stared, the heavier the pressure became, especially on Kunpeng. At this point, he looked like he had thorns in his back. Just then, Taiyi placed a hand on the chaos bell and quietly transmitted his voice to Dijun. Big brother, are we really not making a move? There are only 7 seats in the front row of the Purple Dawn Palace. I'm telling you, this Tao fortune definitely hides a huge opportunity. We brought our own cushions, but compared to those 7, the difference is obvious at a glance. Taiyi was getting anxious. The more people gathered, the harder it would become to act. Dijun frowned, his gaze sweeping across everyone in the front row, before he answered quietly, "It's not as simple as you think. The 3 pure ones and the ancestral witches are out of the question. Fuxi and Nuwa aren't easy targets either. Even Hongyun, the ancestral witches would probably protect him. Although Wutian, Hongyun, and Genyuanzi hadn't spoken aloud earlier, Dijun had clearly seen the closeness between the 3 of us. He had also seen how I answered Yuanshi without showing the slightest fear of the 3 pure ones. Going against the 12 ancestral witches was something even Dijun did not feel fully confident about. But Taiyi's gaze landed on Kunpeng, and he said directly, "I'm not talking about them. I mean Kunpeng. He's alone. We can force him to give up his seat. It's enough if the 2 of us brothers get just one." As he spoke, he was already about to step forward. Kunpeng instantly sensed it, turned around and glared at Dijun and Taiyi, his eyes full of caution. Dijun immediately grabbed Taiyi and stopped him. "Forget it. The sermon is about to begin. Hongjun Saint might be watching from the shadows. If we make trouble now and end up missing the sermon because of it, that would be a huge loss over a tiny gain." The 2 golden crows of the Sun Star had always been like this. Taiyi was domineering, while Dijun was the more calculating one. Hearing his elder brother say that, Taiyi hesitated for a moment before finally stepping back. But just as frustration rose in his heart, 2 figures suddenly flew into the Purple Dawn Palace. They were Jieyin and Junti. The moment they entered, they swept their eyes across the whole hall, took in the situation in the front row, exchanged a glance, and then walked straight toward the front with a clear goal in mind. Their targets were obvious, Hongyun and Kunpeng. Taiyi's heart tightened immediately. "Brother, this is bad. Those 2 are about to make a move." He couldn't help regretting it. He had wanted to act earlier, but Dijun had stopped him. Now the advantage was about to fall into Jieyin and Junti's hands instead. Dijun's pupils narrowed slightly, but a faint smile appeared on his face. Jieyin and Junti had arrived too late. They hadn't seen the closeness between Wutian, Hongyun, and Genyuanzi, nor did they know what had just happened between me and Yuanshi. Dijun quietly transmitted his voice to Taiyi with a smile in his heart. "Relax, a good show is about to begin." The moment Taiyi heard that, he immediately understood what Dijun meant. His eyes lit up as he looked at Jieyin and Junti, and a trace of expectation rose in his heart. I also sensed something and suddenly turned my head to look at the 2 of them, a half smile appearing on my face. Junti's steps paused for a split second. Who is this guy? Why is he looking at us like that? Thoughts flashed through his mind, but he quickly suppressed them. Gritting his teeth, he walked over to stand behind Hongyun and Kunpeng. The expression on his face instantly turned incomparably sorrowful, like the most tragic person in existence. Alas, my brother and I came all the way from the west. The road was long and the chaos was full of danger. And yet we still arrived late. Now there isn't even a single seat left for us. Ah, how tragic. How tragic. Junti truly had no shame. He actually squeezed out a few tears on the spot. Even I couldn't help clicking my tongue in amazement as I watched. Jian stood beside him sighing miserably. He already wore a permanently bitter expression anyway, so even without crying he looked pitiful enough. When the others heard those words, all of them frowned and looked over, their faces full of disapproval. One cold snort after another rang out around the hall. No seat is no seat. Just because you're miserable doesn't mean you're right. Why should anyone give one to you? Jayan and Junti were innate beings of the Western lands. During the Dragon Hand Great Tribulation, when Hongjun and Luoho fought the Dao Monster War, the Western world had been shattered. The formation diagrams of the Immortal Slaying Sword formation had been created by Luoho by ripping out the Western earth veins. With the spiritual veins torn away, the West became barren beyond belief, with thin spiritual energy and almost no vitality. But what did that have to do with everyone gathered in the Purple Dawn Palace? It wasn't like they owed the West anything. As Junti kept crying and complaining, more and more disdainful gazes landed on him. But Junti's Dao heart was solid and his skin was even thicker. Faced with all those strange looks, his expression didn't change in the slightest. He kept going on and on about the suffering of the West, about how miserable the two brothers had been, all while staring directly at the backs of Hongjun and Kunpeng. His gaze was so focused it almost felt physical, making both of them increasingly uncomfortable. Junti kept wailing while locking onto the two of them. The light in his eyes was so intense it was practically tangible. Hongyun sighed inwardly, so it's finally here. But remembering what I had told him earlier, Hongyun gritted his teeth and forced himself to endure it, ignoring Junti's non-stop rambling behind him. Then right at that moment, Junti suddenly activated his mana. An invisible wave of force slammed toward Hongyun and Kunpeng, nearly knocking the two of them off their cushions. In an instant, spiritual light flashed around both of them as they hurriedly circulated their mana and forcibly stabilized themselves. Hongyun's face darkened as he turned around to look at Junti. Kunpeng lowered his head and ground his teeth, his expression dark as ink. Zhen Yuanzi also reacted at once and frowned together with Hongyun as they looked toward Junti. But Junti wore a face full of pleading innocence, as if the attack just now had nothing to do with him at all. I only ask that you two fellow Taoists fulfill this request and yield your seats to my brother and me. We will definitely be grateful forever. In the future, when the beings of the West prosper, they too will remember your kindness. Junti spoke softly, but the look in his eyes as he stared at Hongyun was incredibly firm. It was obvious that unless he got what he wanted, he would never let this go. Hongyun sucked in a cold breath. If Hongyun refused outright, then the question became whether he was ready to fight the two of them head-on. Even if he managed to keep the seat, being remembered by those two afterward would be no small trouble either. For a moment, both Hongyun and Zhen Yuanzi felt a trace of regret. Wouldn't it have been better if they had just stood firm earlier and given the seat to fellow Taoist Wu Tian? At least then they wouldn't be stuck in this awkward situation now. As they thought that, both of them instinctively looked toward me. But neither of them could bring themselves to say it out loud. If they asked me to take the seat now, it would basically mean asking me to stand up for them. The moment I saw that, my heart stirred. The timing had arrived. Junti didn't understand why the two of them were looking at me, but he didn't care much. He had no impression of me at all, so in his mind that meant I couldn't be anyone especially important. He had already weighed the situation in his heart. He didn't dare provoke the three pure ones. Fuxi and Nua were protected by Fuxi's determined attitude, so they were better avoided too. Houtu was even less an option. That left only Hongyun and Kunpeng as viable targets. Hongyun had Zhen Yuanzi beside him, sure, but Junti already knew what kind of personalities the two of them had, so he didn't take them too seriously. With that thought, Junti gave a light smile and said, "If the two fellow Taoists are willing to fulfill this request for my brother and me, we will definitely remember this kindness and owe you both a karmic favor." As he spoke, he started edging closer to Hongyun. Right then, I suddenly stretched out my hand and stopped him. At the same time, I said calmly, "If you want to snatch fellow Taoist Hongyun's seat, have you asked me first?" Jane and Junti both turned their eyes toward me at once, their expressions unfriendly. "And who are you?" Junti said coldly, "to meddle in other people's business?" Since they had only seen me sitting with the Ancestral Witches. While I myself didn't radiate any fierce, baleful aura, they never guessed I was part of the Wu clan, so naturally they weren't polite to me at all. Junti was even wondering whether he should directly teach this random nobody a lesson, kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, and make everyone obediently hand over the seat. At the same time, the great powers who had arrived earlier and already knew who I was, all revealed amused expressions. They looked at Jieyin and Junti like they were watching a free drama unfold. I paid no attention to the pressure coming from the two of them and replied casually, "Fellow Taoist Hongjun already agreed to give this seat to me. So if you want to take it, of course you have to ask what I think first." Before I could finish, Junti snorted and cut me off. "And if you say that, then it must be true? Who exactly do you think you are?" He hadn't even had time to sweep out his seven treasures wonderful tree when a thick wave of baleful aura slammed into him and forced him to stagger backward. Dijang and the others all stood up at once. Dijang didn't care in the slightest that this was the Purple Dawn Palace. Without a moment of hesitation, he threw a punch straight at Junti. Jujuin attacked Jian at the same time, and the other ancestral witches were already itching to move. In an instant, the atmosphere in the Purple Dawn Palace turned explosive. The moment the two ancestral witches made their move, Dijiang roared in fury, "This is the Purple Dawn Palace, and yet you still dare bark like that? What kind of thing are you? How dare you bully my Wu clan? You're courting death." The entire hall was shocked. Everyone stared at the ancestral witches in disbelief. No one expected Dijang and Jujuyin to actually attack without hesitation. Their style was overbearing to the extreme. They truly didn't care that this was the Purple Dawn Palace at all. Jieyin and Junti were hit so hard that the mana around their bodies trembled violently, and both of them stumbled back several steps, their faces full of shock as they looked at the ancestral witches. Junti's heart was shaking. He had only dared secretly shove Hongyun and Kunpeng with hidden force just now. He hadn't dared attack openly. Yet the ancestral witches had gone straight for him without even blinking. Rage and hesitation both flashed across his face. Jain and Junti didn't dare strike back. The ancestral witches might dare start trouble in the Purple Dawn Palace and not care about missing the sermon, but they were not the same. Dijiang took one huge step forward, pressing toward them with overwhelming baleful aura. "This is a saint's dojo, and yet you think the Wu clan can't act arrogantly here?" The expressions on Jian and Junti's faces turned even uglier. That was when I stood up and pulled Dijiang back. Then I smiled at Jian and Junti, though the words coming out of my mouth made both of them feel a chill run down their spines. "You two make a fair point. The Purple Dawn Palace is a place for hearing the Tao, not for fighting. Fine, we'll put this karma on hold for today. Once the sermon ends, my Wu clan will head to the Western world and settle this karma with the two of you properly." How about that? The expressions on Jane and Junti changed drastically. My words immediately drew the attention of everyone else in the hall, too. Before this, they had seen that I carried no obvious baleful aura and had been smiling the whole time, so they never expected that the moment I opened my mouth, I would speak with the exact same domineering style as the ancestral witches. Quite a few people immediately started muttering inwardly that the Wu clan really was outrageously tyrannical. Dijun and Taiyi, who had been quietly waiting to enjoy the show, exchanged glances, both with faint smiles in their eyes. Dijun's gaze seemed to say, "See? Didn't I tell you not to act rashly?" Then his eyes drifted slowly toward the depths of the Purple Dawn Palace. Hongjun still hadn't appeared, and that made Dijun inwardly surprised. Could it be that Hongjun really didn't care? The ancestral witches had practically attacked people in his own hall and slapped his face in public, yet he still hadn't shown himself. Deep in the Purple Dawn Palace, Hongjun had been watching the entire conflict unfold. His gaze was long and distant, his brows tightly furrowed. He had already been displeased with the ancestral witches for nearly ruining his arrangements and forcing him to intervene outside the palace, and now this had happened too. What exactly was wrong with this Wu clan? Why did they keep creating variables that lay outside the heavenly secrets? Hongjun couldn't understand it. According to his original arrangement, Hongyun was supposed to give up his seat to Jaeyin and Junti, and then Kunpeng would be forced off his as well. Only with things developing that way could Hongjun later bestow the primordial violet qi upon the two of them. It wasn't because Hongjun valued Jain and Junti that highly. The real reason was that he carried a huge karmic debt with the Western world. During the Tao Devil War, the West had almost been shattered. Its spiritual energy had grown thin, and its vitality had become sparse. If Hongjun wanted to resolve that karma, he had two options. Either sit in the West himself and repair it personally, or find someone else to shoulder that karma for him. Jian and Junti were his chosen candidates. Hongjun had already decided that after his third sermon, he would merge with the Tao. Naturally, he could not simply stand by and let his plans fall apart. But he also could not personally make a move against the ancestral witches. In his heart, he let out a silent sigh. Being a saint was powerful, yes, but it also came with the restrictions of the heavenly Tao. The next great calamity belonged to the flourishing era of the Wu clan, and Hongjun himself could not personally break that larger fate. After struggling for a long moment, his heart finally settled on a decision. Meanwhile, after I threatened them, Jian and Junti stood under the gaze of everyone in the hall, their faces shifting again and again. In the end, Junti made up his mind, cupped his hands toward me, and said, "Please forgive us, fellow Taoist. My brother and I arrived late and did not know that fellow Taoist Hongjun had already given this seat to you. That is why we rashly stepped forward to discuss it. We hope fellow Taoist will be magnanimous. After saying that, Junti actually cupped his hands respectfully toward both me and the Ancestral Witches. That sudden soft attitude completely stunned the Ancestral Witches. Dijeng turned to look at me in total confusion, like he was asking whether those two had gotten their heads beaten loose. The Ancestral Witches had just attacked them, and yet their attitude had instantly changed by a full 180 degrees. They had gone straight from stiff and aggressive to bowing and lowering themselves. And it wasn't only the Ancestral Witches who were stunned. A burst of uproar immediately exploded through the crowd of onlookers as well. Everyone stared at Jain and Junti in disbelief. I had only threatened them with one sentence, and they had folded immediately. Even under all those staring eyes, Jain and Junti didn't change expression in the slightest. Watching that, I couldn't help clicking my tongue inwardly. So it really was just like the legend said. I gave Junti a calm glance and nodded slightly. Then I signaled for the Ancestral Witches to sit back down. Since this was still the Purple Dawn Palace, I didn't continue pressing the matter. On the surface, I looked relaxed and easygoing, as if I had let the issue pass without caring. But in reality, my wariness toward Jain and Junti had deepened even more. If they simply became Heavenly Tao Saints in the future according to the original course of events, that alone didn't worry me much. But if saints had no shame and weren't constrained by face or ordinary rules, then that was genuinely troublesome. There may be 1,000 days spent being a thief, but there's no such thing as 1,000 days spent guarding against thieves. And these would be 2 saint-level thieves at that. I wasn't the only one thinking that way. Tai Ching, Fuxi, Dijun, and the others all changed the way they looked at Jieyin and Junti too. They didn't know the future course of events, and they certainly didn't know that these two would become saints someday, but they had still developed a new level of caution toward them. Dijun quietly transmitted his voice to Tai Yi. Those two know when to bend and when to hold firm. In the future, they will definitely amount to something. There will surely be a place for them in the primordial world. Tai Yi's personality was overbearing, and he couldn't really stomach Junti's style. Even though he trusted Dijun deeply, he still couldn't help replying, "In the struggle for the great Tao, one should move forward without fear." And yet all Wu Tian did was threaten him once, and Junti immediately bent over to apologize. "You call that someone who can achieve greatness?" Dijun looked at his unconvinced younger brother and shook his head with a faint laugh. "You don't understand. Sometimes stepping back is the only way to move forward. Lowering yourself can be the way to preserve what matters. If those words had come from someone else, there would be no reason to fear them. But when they come from the mouth of the Wu clan, then they can absolutely make good on them. There's no doubt about that. Once the sermon ends, that becomes the best possible time to cultivate. If they keep clashing with the Ancestral Witches, then even if they don't lose their lives, their cultivation will still be dragged down. And besides, the Western world is one thing. But could they even be sure of surviving the trip there from the Purple Dawn Palace? Do they still want to properly attend future sermons or not? Thinking through it that way, Junti's method, while a little embarrassing, was actually the most stable and sensible choice. In front of the Ancestral Witches, admitting defeat was not really shameful at all. After taking that loss, Jain and Junti didn't dare cause any more trouble. They also didn't want to sit near the Ancestral Witches anymore, so they simply went to the back of the 3 pure ones and sat behind Taiking and Yuanxi respectively. Taiking didn't move in the slightest, and in the end he said nothing at all. Once the 2 of them stepped away, Zhen Yuanzi, Hongjun, and even Kunping all let out quiet breaths of relief. The weight in their hearts was instantly much lighter. Hongjun hurriedly stood up. "Fellow Taoist Wu Tian, this cushion should be yours after all. The reason I had stepped in for him just now was precisely because I claimed that the seat had already been yielded to me. So at this point, it really wasn't appropriate for him to keep sitting there. On top of that, after everything that had just happened, both Hongyun and Zhen Yuanzi felt even more strongly that this cushion carried far too much karma. It wasn't something they wanted to be involved with. So when Hongyun spoke, Zhen Yuanzi also gave a slight nod beside him. My heart moved slightly, but I still refused out loud. There's no need. After what just happened, I doubt anyone will dare trouble you again. You can just keep sitting. The truth was, I was curious too. If Hongyun did not give away his seat and did not damage his own fortune, then would the later events still happen? Would Hongyun still die, be reborn, and become Shenong? And there was another point. Right now, Kunpeng still had his seat and had not lost it. That meant he also had no reason to resent Hongyun over it. So, would he still ambush Hongyun in the future? But Hongyun's attitude was extremely firm. Fellow Taoist stepped forward for me under the pretext that the seat had already been yielded to you. If I keep sitting here now, then that excuse becomes false in name and reality. Wouldn't that just make others look down on the Wu clan? He didn't even listen to my attempt to persuade him. He directly stood up and moved to sit beside Zhen Yuanzi instead. The expression on his face instantly relaxed, as if he had just put down a burden weighing 1,000 jin. At that point, what more could I even say? Still, I had no intention of sitting there myself. I wasn't interested in primordial violet chi, and I didn't want to walk the path of severing the three corpses either. Right now, I carried the 12 laws of the ancestral witches within me. Naturally, the road I wanted to walk was Pangu's road, to prove the Tao through strength just as Pangu had. And by proving the Tao through strength, I didn't mean some law of force or a separate grand Tao. I meant using one's own strength to reach the absolute limit, and then stepping into the Tao openly and upright through overwhelming power alone. There was one more point too. Even if I sat there, based on the way Hongjun had already interfered before, I wasn't convinced he would actually distribute the primordial violet chi according to the seats anyway. The primordial violet chi was in his hands. How he distributed it and what conditions he tied it to, wasn't that entirely up to him? The moment I thought of that, my heart stirred, and I turned toward Dijang with a smile. Brother, why don't you take the seat instead? Dijang rejected it without even thinking. He waved his hand and laughed. Forget it. I don't even have a primordial spirit. Even if there really is heavenly Tao fortune in that seat, what would it matter to me? If you hadn't insisted, we wouldn't even have bothered coming to the Purple Dawn Palace in the first place. I nodded slightly, then turned toward Xuanming. Xuanming Jie, then how about you? Xuanming was about to refuse too, but Dijang suddenly laughed loudly. Ha! I knew it. You kid really are closer to Xuanming and Houtu. If there's anything good, those two are the first ones you think of. The first seat you pushed to the Wu clan side went to Houtu. If the second goes to Xuanming, that works too. At those words, a faint flush appeared on Xuanming's pale, cool face. She glared at Dijang and said irritably, I don't have a primordial spirit either, but I didn't care about any of that. Before she could finish talking, I directly released an invisible force, pulled her over, and pressed both hands onto her shoulders, forcing her down into the seat. Why think so much? Xuanming Jie, just sit peacefully. The warmth from my hands reached her shoulders, and Xuanming immediately circulated her mana and shook my hands away. We had sparred countless times before. There had already been no shortage of physical contact between us. But this time, the feeling was strangely different for her. It was as if my hands were burning hot, and the sensation made her feel oddly restless. Even after knocking my hands away, though, she didn't stand up and refuse. Instead, she turned to look at Houtu, only to find Houtu gazing back at her with a half-smile. Xuanming immediately withdrew her eyes and said, If Houtu Mei can sit there, why can't I? This seat was brought here because of him anyway. He trained with me so many times and even worried about my combat techniques. It's only right that I repay him once. After thinking that through, Xuanming turned back to me and gave me a light nod. All around the Purple Dawn Palace, everyone watched the ancestral witches push the seats back and forth between one another, and their eyes practically turned red. These were seats they would have fought to the death for, yet in the eyes of the Wu clan, they seemed almost unimportant. Junti himself couldn't help sighing inwardly in speechless frustration. If you people don't even care about the seat, then why did you make such a huge scene fighting me over it? What was the point of that? Even Hongjun, who had been the one to give up the seat, was stunned for a long time. Then he turned back toward Zhenyuanzi with a bitter smile. In his heart, he let out a quiet sigh. Originally, part of him had still felt reluctant, and he had even wondered whether Wu Tian might have only come for the sake of this seat in the first place. But now that thought instantly vanished. In its place, a deep sense of guilt rose within him. With Xuanming now seated, the final three cushions were arranged as Xuanming, Kunpeng, and Houtu. Dijiang's gaze suddenly sharpened and landed on Kunpeng's back like a solid blade. Wu Tian, should we? As he spoke, he quietly made a chopping motion toward Kunpeng's back. A faint wave of baleful aura spread out, making Kunpeng's body jolt sharply. I thought for a moment, then said, Forget it. There's no need. At the same time, I couldn't help finding the whole thing a little funny. In the original course of events, Kunpeng had really been unlucky. He had only just managed to occupy a seat, only for Jian and Junti to steal it from him. And because he was weaker than those two, all he could do in his helpless fury was vent his hatred onto Hongjun instead. But this time, because of my interference, that guy had actually gotten lucky. Since the previous conflict had already exploded so dramatically, naturally no one else dared make a move against Kunpeng now. After all, who knew whether the ancestral witches would jump up and start another fight? Hearing my words, Dijiang nodded and withdrew his gaze from Kunpeng. The pressure around him faded as well. The instant that happened, Kunpeng felt the crushing pressure vanish from his back and silently let out a breath of relief. Then, from the corner of his eye, he looked toward me. A strange emotion slowly rose in his heart. After staying silent for a long time, Kunpeng finally spoke in a low voice. Today, Kunpeng owes fellow Taoist a favor. I will remember this karma. In the future, I will repay it. I looked at Kunpeng and smiled. The truth was, today Kunpeng had really incurred a major karma toward me. And it wasn't only because of the seat beneath him. In the original course of events, when he was driven from his seat, Yuanshi Tianzun had even thrown out that famous insult, mocking him as some lowly fur-covered, egg-born creature with scales and claws, unworthy to stand alongside them. That had trampled Kunpeng's dignity straight into the dirt. But now the situation had changed, and none of that happened. Kunpeng had escaped the humiliation that should have fallen on him. I didn't say any of this aloud. I simply gave him a faint smile and nod, then turned to look toward the front of the hall, and silently waited for Hongjun to appear, so the sermon could begin. From that point on, I stayed very quiet. There were already many things in the Purple Dawn Palace that I had changed, and many others that still remained unchanged. I didn't intend to force every last thing. Instead, I quietly wondered how events would develop from here. Jin and Junti had failed to obtain the seats. Instead, Xuanming and Kunpeng had them, and Kunpeng no longer had any reason to resent Hongyun. So what would the great trend of the future become now? Would Hongjun truly grant the primordial violet chi to Xuanming and Kunpeng instead? Or would he still give it to Jieyin and Junti, just like in the original flow of events? I was full of anticipation. As time passed, fewer and fewer people continued arriving. Soon the 3,000-year deadline was reached. Suddenly my heart trembled. I sharply raised my head and looked forward. There, seated at the front, was a figure with an indifferent expression. Boundless Tao rhythm flowed around him, and above his head floated a jade-colored round disc. Wave after wave of law power spread outward from it, and rays of light linked into the formless void behind him. Hongjun, my heart cried out in shock. The jade disc above him was naturally the jade butterfly of creation. And what stunned me even more was that I had absolutely no idea when Hongjun had arrived. It was as if he had always been sitting there all along, and only now had I finally noticed him. At that moment, Hongjun's deep gaze swept over and met my eyes directly. Instantly, it felt as though I had been struck by lightning. My mind shook violently. In the blink of an eye, my mana started circulating on its own. Inside my soul, the primordial measuring heaven ruler burst forth with dark yellow golden light, while the marks carved into my soul flickered faintly as well. My heavenly secrets and fate were instantly suppressed by the primordial measuring heaven ruler, and the true intent of Pangu inside my soul stirred and threw everything into disorder. Hongjun's eyes shifted slightly. Inwardly, he let out a quiet sigh and immediately withdrew his gaze. Why did this Wutian possess such extraordinary fortune? To think he had actually obtained a merit supreme treasure to protect himself. Hongjun felt a trace of helplessness. He possessed many treasures in his hands, but not a single merit treasure among them. Those things were all inevitably tied to Pangu's legacy, and by their nature, they resonated with Pangu's orthodox line. Just as Hongjun knew that Taiching possessed the exquisite pagoda of heaven and earth, he had never once tried to seize that merit treasure for himself. And because the merit treasure had suppressed things for that brief instant, Hongjun's quick glance hadn't achieved its goal, so in the end, he could only give up. Originally, he had wanted to use the moment I wasn't paying attention to probe a few more hidden secrets, but now he could only force that thought down. There was no way he could be too blatant about it. After becoming a heavenly Tao saint, Hongjun had suddenly realized something. Yes, he could now borrow the power of the heavenly Tao, but the restrictions placed on him had also become far greater. If this had happened before, he probably would have acted directly, probing my secrets without restraint, and maybe even using overwhelming power to suppress me. But now, he had no choice except to follow the rules of the heavenly Tao. He was a heavenly Tao saint now, which meant he was already part of those rules. If he still insisted on acting recklessly and breaking them himself, then what kind of idiot would that make him? The pressure around me vanished instantly, and I frowned as I slowly looked toward Hongjun. I knew very well that this had definitely not been some accidental release of saintly pressure. Hongjun had done it on purpose. But so what? By now, he had already withdrawn his gaze and was sitting there with a perfectly calm expression, as if nothing had happened at all. All I could do was grumble inwardly and bury my irritation. At the same time, everyone else had finally noticed Hongjun's arrival too. A stir instantly spread through the Purple Dawn Palace, and then voices rose together in salute. We greet Saint Hongjun. Thank you, Saint, for preaching the Tao for us. Hongjun gave a light response, acting as though he had completely failed to notice the ancestral witch's indifferent attitude. Then his gaze swept over the 7 seats, and he said flatly, "In the future, sit like this." Everyone quickly answered in acknowledgement. After that, Hongjun turned his eyes toward the gate of the Purple Dawn Palace and said to the 2 child attendants, "The time has come. Close the gate." The 2 jade-like child attendants, 1 male and 1 female, stood up from either side, bowed respectfully to Hongjun, and moved to shut the doors of the Purple Dawn Palace. I looked over curiously. Earlier, I had been so focused on rushing in and seizing a seat that I had completely forgotten to pay attention to these 2. They were the legendary Heoqian and Yaoqi. They might look like insignificant little children right now, but anyone who could become Hongjun's attendants was obviously no simple figure. In the future, Heoqian would even obtain heaven's mandate, take charge of the heavenly court. And in the end, even the great calamity of investiture of the gods would be triggered because he filed his complaint. The disciples of the three teachings all looked down on Houtu, but they forgot something important. Hongjun had also listened to the Tao in the Purple Dawn Palace. If you really thought about it, that made him a fellow student of Tai King and the others. So what exactly gave them the right to look down on him? The more I thought about it, the more I wanted to roast the whole situation. But then I remembered my own identity, and a smile rose quietly in my heart. I was an ancestral witch. The more chaotic things became inside the profound gate, the better it was for me. Very soon the doors of the Purple Dawn Palace closed. Everyone looked at Hongjun with burning eyes, their expressions practically screaming for knowledge. Hongjun didn't deliberately play games with them. He simply gave a brief opening statement first, once again explaining why he was preaching in the Purple Dawn Palace. I am a heavenly Tao saint. I bear the responsibility of enlightening the beings of the primordial world and maintaining the operation of the heavenly Tao. That is why I preach and transmit the Tao here in the Purple Dawn Palace. The moment he finished speaking, Hongjun's aura changed sharply. Boundless Tao rhythm spread from his body and swept through the entire Purple Dawn Palace. Instantly, infinite mysterious phenomena filled the void. I hurriedly steadied my mind too. In the next moment, the endless sounds of the Tao rose up, and the Tao he preached was the way of the carefree immortal. After becoming a heavenly Tao saint, if Hongjun wanted to go even further, then apart from his own cultivation and comprehension, the most important thing was accumulating and competing for destiny and merit. And the best way to do that was through spreading teachings and enlightening living beings. Naturally, Hongjun wanted to use this chance in the Purple Dawn Palace to spread his immortal Tao, preferably across the entire primordial world. The more people cultivated the immortal Tao, the more support he, as the master of that Tao, would receive. Every breakthrough made by someone cultivating the immortal Tao would help Hongjun expand its boundaries and strengthen its power. To put it simply, it was like employees in a company working hard, generating results, and getting promoted within the company. But in the end, all of that still strengthened the company itself and made the chairman richer and richer, unless, of course, you went out and started your own business. That was what opening your own Tao was like. Or you could build your own Tao on top of the original framework, which was more like incubating a subsidiary inside the company. You'd still have to give up part of the shares, but at least you'd gain most of the control. In the future, Taiking would become a saint through the Golden Core Great Tao, Yuanxi through his own path, and Tongtian through the Sword Tao. That was the same principle. According to Hongjun's explanation, the realms of the primordial world were divided into heavenly immortal, true immortal, profound immortal, golden immortal, Taiyi golden immortal, and Great Luo golden immortal. Beyond those were Hunyuan golden immortal and Hunyuan Great Luo golden immortal. These were the cultivation realms of the immortal Tao, and in the future, they would become the standard realm classification accepted throughout the entire primordial world. A quasi-saint was a Hunyuan golden immortal, while a saint was a Hunyuan Great Luo golden immortal. But there was an important distinction. A saint was definitely a Hunyuan Great Luo golden immortal, yet a Hunyuan Great Luo golden. The immortal was not necessarily a saint, only by proving the Tao through Hunyuan and entrusting one's primordial spirit to the heavenly Tao could one truly attain the rank of saint and gain the blessing of the heavenly Tao, becoming undying and indestructible from then on. When everyone in the Purple Dawn Palace heard that, they all nodded slightly. At last, they finally had a clearer concept of what a saint was. One by one, their eyes lit up, and they looked like they were dying to ask how exactly one became a saint. This time, Hongjun began his sermon from the heavenly immortal realm. As he explained the immortal Tao, strange phenomena gradually appeared across the Purple Dawn Palace. Golden lotus flowers rose from the ground, heavenly flowers rained from above, an endless spiritual energy gathered together while the laws of the world fluttered through the air like ribbons. Everyone sank deep into it. Even someone like me, who had already decided to cultivate according to the Wu clan's methods and walk the path of proving the Tao through strength, still listened with great interest. Mountains can be polished by other stones. No matter what path I walked later, hearing Hongjun explain the Tao still gave rise to endless insights in my heart. As Hongjun taught the cultivation of the immortal Tao, I also used it inwardly to verify my own path. The 9 revolutions. Mysterious art inside me began rotating with a roar. My body gave rise to a deep hunger, and even my primordial spirit started shining brilliantly. The primordial, measuring heaven ruler, which was suppressing my primordial spirit, slowly turned and continuously released dark yellow golden light. A powerful devouring force was born. The energy and laws filling the Purple Dawn Palace came surging toward me and were swallowed down in great gulps. A huge vortex formed above my head, shaped like a funnel, and endless heavenly flowers and golden lotuses poured into it. At that moment, I wasn't simply cultivating my primordial spirit. Under the blessing of limitless Tao rhythm, My body, soul, and primordial spirit were all cultivating together. The 9 revolutions? Mysterious art truly deserved its reputation as the supreme body-refining method. There was no conflict at all between the 3 paths. The spiritual energy was refined by my fleshly body, while the heavy power of the laws caused the marks engraved on my soul to flash once again. They were carved deeper and deeper, my understanding of the laws rapidly increasing, and then, under the support of body and soul alike, my primordial spirit started growing at incredible speed. Compared to the 3 pure ones and the others, the commotion caused by my cultivation wasn't especially huge, but it still drew Hongjun's attention. Even the rhythm of his sermon paused for a moment. His gaze turned toward me in surprise. How is this possible? Isn't he a Wu clansman? Hongjun's heart filled with confusion. The more he looked at me, the more he felt that this Wu clansman named Wutian was shrouded in layers and layers of mist so dense that even a heavenly Tao saint like him couldn't see through me. The Wu clan cultivated heavy, baleful energy. Logically speaking, they should be the most repelled by pure, clear Qi, meaning innate spiritual energy. So how was I cultivating this smoothly? Was I even still a member of the Wu clan? With a shift of thought, Hongjun continued preaching without pause and glanced toward Dijiang, Zhu Yin, and the other ancestral witches. Their reactions were exactly what he had expected. Every one of them looked restless, like there were nails under their backsides. Judging by their expressions, if the doors of the Purple Dawn Palace hadn't already been closed, these guys probably would have slipped out long ago. Hongjun nodded slightly to himself. Yes, that looked like a proper Wu clan. Then he looked toward Xuanming and Houtu, and a deeper meaning entered his gaze. Houtu was one thing. Although her early birth of a primordial spirit had been beyond his expectations, it still hadn't strayed too far from the greater trend of the heavenly Tao. But Xuanming was different. Thanks to my ridiculous chain of operations, Xuanming had gained a seat in the Purple Dawn Palace this time. Once Hongjun started preaching, the cushion beneath her continuously released dense Tao sounds, and those sounds quickly suppressed the heavy, baleful aura in her body. Endless innate spiritual energy poured into her frame. Unlike before, when it was constantly worn down and consumed by the baleful force of her fleshly body, now it slowly circulated inside her along an extremely mysterious path, endlessly condensing soul power. The embryonic form of a primordial spirit was already about to appear. Hongjun sighed inwardly once again. He didn't know whether the heavenly Tao itself had changed, or whether this had always been part of the original course of fate. Then he slowly closed his eyes and continued teaching the way of the carefree immortal. Very soon, 10,000 years passed. Once Hongjun finished explaining the cultivation of the Great Luo Golden Immortal Realm, he said calmly, when one reaches the peak of Great Luo Golden Immortal, perfects one's own laws, and clearly understands one's own Tao, one may then advance into the realm of quasi-saint. The Tao sound stopped abruptly there. The Tao rhythm, energy, and laws permeating the Purple Dawn Palace gradually dispersed. Everyone looked as if they had just awakened from a dream. One after another, they came out of their state of enlightenment and looked up at Hongjun in front of them, their eyes full of confusion. That's it? Just like that? How exactly are you supposed to break through into the quasi-saint realm? Keep talking, old man! But before anyone could ask, Hongjun's voice rang out again. The 10,000-year period has ended. This sermon is over. In 3,000 years, I will preach again. At that time, I will explain how to achieve the quasi-saint realm. After saying that, his gaze swept once across the crowd, and then his figure slowly disappeared. Everyone's hearts felt like monkeys scratching madly inside them, but no one could exactly chase after a saint and demand more. So all they could do was suppress their impatience, bow respectfully toward the place where Hongjun had vanished, and thank him for his sermon. At that moment, the 2 child attendants stood up, and the doors of the Purple Dawn Palace slowly opened again. At last it was over. Zhurong couldn't help standing up and stretching lazily. The other listeners all turned to the ancestral witches with ugly expressions. They were all thinking the same thing deep down. Our Saint Hongjun was preaching the great Tao here, and you people are acting like this? If they hadn't been too afraid to provoke the ancestral witches, some of them probably would have walked over already to teach them a lesson. Zhurong swept his gaze around and immediately revealed a look of disdain. What are you all staring at? Got a problem? Then he snorted. Anyone who can come here is an innate sacred being. Who among us doesn't have our own Tao? Why should we listen to some carefree immortal Tao and throw away our own foundation? I had just been calming the power inside my body, but the moment I heard that, I suddenly looked up at him. Surprise flashed in my eyes. Zhurong, of all people, could actually think of something like that? In my usual impression, he was the most impatient of all the ancestral witches, and because of his personality, he was also the one Dijiang beat up the most often. Even now, he was still as blunt as ever, but what he said wasn't actually without reason. It seemed I still hadn't fully understood my brothers and sisters after all. In the original course of events, it wasn't as though the ancestral witches had no brains at all. But no matter how clever they were, Their divine abilities still couldn't defeat heaven's arithmetic. Under the layered schemes of a heavenly Tao saint, what could they do even if they wanted to struggle or resist? Even figures like Dijun and Fuxi, who were publicly acknowledged as brilliant and wise beyond measure, still ended up losing. Right then, Zhurong suddenly shouted, "Not good!" Those two from the west slipped away. My thoughts were cut off instantly. I turned and looked toward where Jian and Junti had been sitting, and sure enough, the place was empty. Then I looked toward the gates of the Purple Dawn Palace and could only see two streams of golden light shooting into the chaos, vanishing in the blink of an eye. The people who were still inside and hadn't left yet all frowned when they saw that. A moment ago, some of them had still disliked the way Zhurong had spoken so loudly and shamelessly inside the Purple Dawn Palace. But now, not a single one of them dared send him another reproachful look. Even Jian and Junti had gone out of their way to avoid the Ancestral Witches. What courage did they have to provoke us? To be honest, I hadn't really thought about doing anything to Jian and Junti right away anyway. Chasing after them the second the sermon ended and blocking their path felt a little too much like, "Hey, don't run." It was kind of lame. Besides, those two carried great destiny as well. Even if the Ancestral Witches attacked right now, there was no way they could kill them. It would be better to remember all of this, let the karma grow larger, and then settle everything in one brutal stroke later. Even if they didn't die, I still wanted to strip a layer off them. At that moment, Dijang directly stood up, glanced toward the gate of the Purple Dawn Palace, and snorted, "Run? Do they really think they can run?" If we actually want to teach them a lesson, we can just chase them all the way to the Western world. What, are they never going back to the West again? Then he turned to me and said, "We haven't left yet. Let's go settle accounts with them right now." Dijang's voice was loud enough for everyone still inside the Purple Dawn Palace to hear. Their expressions changed dramatically at once, and some of the more timid ones lowered their heads and hurried straight out the gate, terrified that the Ancestral Witches might suddenly remember them too. These people were way too vengeful, way too reckless, and way too impossible to reason with. Nobody wanted to mess with them. I immediately smiled bitterly and said, "Forget it. Put it on the tab for now. We'll spare them this once and settle everything together in the future. We still need to hurry back and check on how the clansmen are doing. We've been gone too long." The moment I said that, the Ancestral Witches immediately grew anxious too. Right. We need to get back and have a look. This time, we had set out 3,000 years before the sermon even began, and then the sermon itself had lasted another 10,000 years. Even though we had left plenty of instructions before departing, the Ancestral Witches were still deeply worried about the clan. They instantly lost all interest in causing more trouble and started hurrying toward the exit. I was anxious too. Before leaving, I had specifically told Jufeng and the others to search around Mount Buju and look for traces of the innate gourd vine. I had no idea whether they had found anything yet. Just then, Zhenyuanzi and Hongjun quickly stood up and came over to me with smiles on their faces. "Fellow Taoist Wutian, we truly thank everyone for stepping in to help us earlier. My brother and I are deeply grateful." Zhenyuanzi continued, "I don't have much to offer except ginseng fruits. Why not come to my 5 villages temple and sit with us, discuss the Tao, and have a taste?" This time, because the Ancestral Witches had spoken up for them, the two of them felt they owed an enormous karmic debt, but they didn't really know how to repay it. The best thing they could offer was naturally the ginseng fruit, so they immediately extended the invitation. I was definitely interested. This was one of the top 10 innate spiritual roots after all. It flowered once every 3,000 years, bore fruit once every 3,000 years, and only matured after another 3,000 years. One full cycle produced only 30 fruits. Even so, I still didn't agree immediately. Instead, I smiled and said, "Next time." Definitely next time. After all, Dijang and the others were already desperate to get back, and so was I. On top of that, the interval between the first and second sermons was very short, only 3,000 years. And if you included travel time through the chaos, that wasn't much at all. So I politely declined for now. The ginseng fruits weren't going anywhere. Even if I waited until after the next sermon to visit, it would still be fine. Zhenyuanzi had also heard what we had said earlier, so he immediately smiled. "That's fair. After all, fellow Taoists are not like the two of us. You have a great family and a great cause behind you. My brother and I will remember this karma in our hearts. Let us meet again at the next sermon. Whenever you all have free time, we will surely be waiting at the 5 villages temple with the doors open in welcome." After saying that, he cupped his hands to me, then bid farewell to Dijiang and the other Ancestral Witches as well. The Ancestral Witches might have terrible tempers, but they weren't people who couldn't recognize goodwill. They could feel the sincerity from Zhenyuanzi and Hongyun, so they all smiled and nodded back. After the two of them left, Dijiang chuckled and said, "Those two aren't bad." Aside from being a little soft, there's nothing wrong with them. I smiled and nodded too. The reason the ancestral witches looked down on their soft personalities was simply because the two of them had never truly been pushed to the edge. If they were ever forced to that point, then everyone would realize they weren't soft the way they seemed. In the original course of events, Hongjun directly blew up his own soul and tried to drag Kunpeng and the others down with him. Even the primordial violet Qi got blasted to pieces in the process. Didn't that count as temperament? And Zhenyuanzi once linked himself to the great earth of the primordial world through the Earth Book and set up a terrifying barrier. So in the end, it could only be said that the two of them were still too naive. They still hadn't seen through the most fundamental logic of how the primordial world truly operated. Human feelings and social grace mattered, sure, but all of that only worked when it was built on enough strength. Then I looked toward the others. At this point, the three pure ones, Fuxi and Nuwa, had all stood up too. When my gaze met theirs, Yuanxi gave a cold snort and turned his face away, while Fuxi and Nuwa smiled lightly and nodded back, their eyes carrying a trace of curiosity. After returning Fuxi and Nuwa's greeting, I said, "Brothers, let's go too." Then I followed the ancestral witches toward the gate of the Purple Dawn Palace. But as we passed the boy attendant Haoshin, I deliberately slowed down and took an extra look at him. Haoshin looked a little surprised, but he still bowed to me and said respectfully, "Farewell, fellow Taoist." I smiled and nodded, but then a mischievous thought suddenly popped into my head. I raised my hand, rubbed Haoshin's hair a few times, and deliberately messed it all up. Then I laughed and said, "Aight, little guy, keep working hard. I'm rooting for you." Haoshin instantly puffed up in anger and was just about to scold me for being rude. But in the next moment, a flash of blood-red light appeared before his eyes, and 2 drops of ferocious beast essence blood floated in front of him. Essence blood from Great Luo Golden Immortal level ferocious beasts. Haoshin hurriedly looked up, but all he could see was my figure already turning into a streak of light and shooting into the chaos. "That Wu clansman is so weird," Haoshin muttered inwardly. Then he shook his head and looked toward the depths of the Purple Dawn Palace. When he saw that Hongjun hadn't shown up to stop him, delight immediately appeared in his eyes. He hurriedly put away the 2 drops of essence blood, and even took the time to signal to Yaochi across from him, reassuring her that the 2 of them would split them evenly, 1 drop each. Out in the chaos, it was still Dijung and Juju Yin supporting the barrier as we sped through the void at high speed, heading back toward the primordial world. Dijung and Juju Yin both had bright eyes. It seemed that just now, people were everywhere, and there were too many ears around, so we held back earlier and didn't ask. But now that we're alone, how much did all of you gain from this sermon? Did your strength improve at all? The ancestral witch's eyes first fell on me, then shifted toward Xuanming and Houtu. Seeing that, I smiled. Then I'll go first. Hongjun's sermon this time focused on the cultivation of the immortal Tao. Even though it's different from our own path, it still has enormous value as a reference. Every path of cultivation may look different on the surface, but the essence underneath is actually the same. And after listening to Hongjun explain the immortal Tao, I'm even more certain of that now. In the end, it all comes down to refining oneself, turning inner heaven and earth into one's own power, then comprehending laws and engraving them into the self. Once the laws reach perfection and interweave into a true Tao, that is the moment of seizing the fortune of heaven and earth to transform oneself. My own cultivation method is different from the immortal Tao, but there are still many parts I can learn from. And during the sermon, the power of the heavenly Tao was constantly blessing the Purple Dawn Palace, so naturally my gains were enormous. Before this, after refining the ancestral dragon's essence blood and receiving help from the ancestral witches in the chaos, my law engraving had only reached 20%, but after listening to the sermon this time, that progress directly doubled. I've now reached 40%. I smiled and explained, "That's not what I mean. We call ourselves the Wu clan, and maybe some others acknowledge that too. But that doesn't mean the entire primordial world officially recognizes us. If the name isn't properly established, then words and authority won't follow naturally." Then a thought flashed through my mind, and I changed the way I explained it. I simply brought out Pengu's name directly. Smiling, I said, "Besides, our people are growing in number, and the Wu clan is becoming stronger and stronger. Shouldn't we formally announce that to Father God Pengu? Shouldn't we let Father God know that the will and legacy he left behind are continuing?" The moment I said that, exactly as I had expected, all doubts vanished from the ancestral witches' faces. Every single one of them immediately nodded in agreement. Dijang even laughed and said, "Right, exactly right. If we establish the Wu clan, then of course we must announce it to Father God." In the original course of events, even though the Wu clan grew stronger and stronger and the entire primordial world called us the Wu clan, the ancestral witches only truly established the race in a formal sense after Dijun and the others first established the demon clan. This time, I naturally wanted to get ahead of them. If we founded the clan first, there would be a huge amount of merit. And maybe the remnant will of Pangu himself might even be stirred and bless us. There was another point too. If I worded the vow carefully, I might even be able to brush against the great Tao itself. For example, instead of swearing above the heavenly Tao, what if I changed it to above the great Tao? Considering Pangu's status, the great Tao might really respond. And if the great Tao took notice and granted us great Tao merit, then the ancestral witches would make an absurd profit from it. Once that happened, the rest of my later plans could be carried out much more smoothly too. Things like making Xuanming become the North God, letting Zhurong become the Fire God, and so on. Beings like the ancestral witches, these innate divine existences, born directly from heaven and earth, were completely different from the later gods who relied on incense and worship. But I didn't explain that part in detail right now. I plan to wait until after the second sermon, then discuss it with them properly and refine the plan. So in the end, I simply concluded, then it's settled. Brothers and sisters, you can start preparing in advance. After the second sermon, once Xuanming Jie, Houtu Jie, and I return from the Purple Dawn Palace, we'll formally announce our clan to Father God Pangu and establish the Wu clan. Dijeng and the others all nodded in agreement. After that, they said their goodbyes. Even Xuanming and Houtu were leaving temporarily too. They needed to go back and inspect the situation in their tribes. Before she left, Houtu smiled and said, "Once the two of us finish handling the tribe's affairs, we'll come back here and meet up with you. When the time is right, we'll head out directly from here." After all the ancestral witches left, I closed the innate formation and started cultivating inside it. I immersed my thoughts into the innate gourd vine and began continuously comprehending the yin, yang, and 5-element laws contained within it. At first glance, the laws inside the gourd vine seemed to overlap with the laws I carried from the ancestral witches, but in reality, they were not the same at all. The laws of the primordial world were not just some simple physical existence. They were the rules and characteristics behind reality itself. For example, the fire law was the rule of burning and release. It was not just one flame or one specific kind of fire. And because of that, the laws carried by the ancestral witches were actually more extreme and more individualized. Zhurong's fire, for example, was the most violent and explosive kind imaginable. But the laws inside the gourd vine were incredibly pure. As I continued comprehending them, I was surprised to discover that I truly was absorbing huge nourishment from them. The law marks on my soul became deeper and clearer. But the most important change was not that. Around the faint figure formed from the fusion of the 12 laws inside me, something new suddenly appeared. The innate gourd vine itself wound into a circle around that figure like a garland, and all 7 gourds became clearly visible around it. While I was cultivating, Xuanming and Houtu also returned after handling the tribe's affairs and started cultivating here with me. I had no idea how much time passed before Houtu woke me up. When I slowly opened my eyes, I saw Houtu smiling gently. "The time is about right. We should leave now." The first time, we had set out 3,000 years early. This time, we already knew the route, so we didn't need that much extra time. Even so, the chaos was still vast, and the journey would still take a while. I nodded slowly and calmed my mana. This time, my physical body had barely improved at all. That growth was so small it could almost be ignored. But my primordial spirit had advanced tremendously, and it had finally reached balance with my physical body. It was now at the middle stage of Great Luo Golden Immortal. Still, it was not enough. I couldn't help muttering that under my breath. Houtu smiled when she heard me and said, "You were born later than all of us in the first place. You only gained your law power because of the ancestral witch's essence blood. For you to reach this level in such a short amount of time is already incredible. And you're still not satisfied?" It wasn't that I was dissatisfied. It was just that the more the Purple Dawn Palace sermons continued, the closer the calamity between the Wu and Demon clans felt. Of course, I wanted my cultivation speed to become even faster. Not to mention anyone else. Even among the 3 pure ones alone, Tai King was probably already at the peak of Great Luo Golden Immortal. He was likely just waiting for Hongjun to explain the next stage so he could comprehend his own Tao and become a quasi-saint. Naturally, I refused to accept always being pressed beneath the 3 pure ones when I already knew the future course of heaven. Still, I didn't argue. I just smiled and said to the 2 of them, "Let's go. We can't afford to miss the sermon." Xuanming and Houtu both nodded. Then Xuanming took the primordial measuring heaven ruler back out and returned it to me. After that, she and Houtu joined forces, lifted me up with them, and flew out of the primordial world toward the Purple Dawn Palace in the chaos. The first time I went to the Purple Dawn Palace, it had been Dijiang and Jujuyin carrying me there while I sat around like a free passenger, and even turned the whole trip into a cultivation opportunity. This second time wasn't any different. Xuanming and Houtu had taken the matter onto themselves without hesitation. All I had to do was obediently act like the little younger brother. And honestly, there was nothing wrong with being the little younger brother. I had 10 elder brothers and 2 elder sisters, and every single one of them cared about me. They stood in front of me when danger came, and they never forgot me when benefits appeared. That kind of treatment was ridiculously good. This time, I didn't continue cultivating during the trip. Instead, I chatted cheerfully with Xuanming and Houtu along the way. After taking back the primordial measuring heaven ruler, I smiled and asked Xuanmingjie, have you fully refined the northern black abyss water controlling banner yet? Xuanming nodded slightly, then said flatly, not fully, but it's already enough to suppress and block the baleful aura. As she spoke, a trace of frustration appeared on her face. The northern black abyss water-controlling banner could suppress the baleful aura, yes, but under the pressure of her powerful body, her primordial spirit was still cultivating very slowly. Worse, even her body cultivation had started to be affected. In this state, she naturally couldn't cultivate as wildly as DJing and the others by greedily devouring baleful aura to temper her body. The stronger her physical body became, the more pressure it placed on her primordial spirit. I quickly tried to comfort her. Don't be anxious. Houtu isn't in a hurry either. Once your primordial spirit truly reaches a high enough level, your physical body will definitely surge upward afterward, too. Then I seriously reminded her that she absolutely had to use the next 2 Purple Dawn Palace sermons to increase her primordial spirit's strength as much as possible. Xuanming immediately shot me a glare. I know. Why do you sound more like the elder sister here? You've already said this once before. Do I really need you worrying this much? That was what she said aloud, but inside she was deeply moved. Her personality simply wasn't the type that was good at expressing those feelings, or maybe she was too embarrassed to do it. Just like before, every time she was concerned about me, she still insisted on beating me half to death while doing it. I instantly grinned. Then I looked toward Houtu. She smiled warmly and said, the 9 heavens resting soil you gave me has helped me tremendously. The earth law within it has benefited me greatly. Really, I should be the one thanking you. I immediately waved my hands. At the very beginning, my goal had only been to strengthen my bonds with the ancestral witches, especially with an ancestral witch like Houtu. That way I could more securely cling to the biggest thigh of all. But the more time I spent with them, the more I saw the truth. The ancestral witches might have explosive tempers, but in front of me, this younger brother, they had never shown that brutal side of themselves. What they showed me was their open, straightforward, warm side. If I put myself in their shoes, how could I not be moved? And once I thought of Xuanming and Houtu again, and of the original fate that had awaited them, I couldn't stop myself from speaking. 2 elder sisters, don't worry. I'll definitely find a way to help both of you attain the Tao. I'll make sure you live better lives. Xuanming and Houtu were both a little stunned. They could clearly feel how sincere and genuine I was when I said that, but neither of them understood why I would suddenly say something like that out of nowhere. After a brief silence, Houtu smiled and said, Aren't you always shouting for us to protect you? Fine then. Once we attain the Tao, we'll definitely protect you properly. By the time she finished speaking, the gate of the Purple Dawn Palace had already opened. The 3 of us hurried inside. Maybe it was because I had given Heiyoshin and Yaochi ferocious beast essence blood when the first sermon ended, but this time, the moment we entered, those 2 little attendants, who normally acted serious and proper, immediately revealed faint smiles and cupped their hands toward me. I smiled back in return and then headed toward the front of the hall. Only then did I realize that the 3 of us were actually a little late this time. At the very least, the front seats were almost completely filled. The only empty spots left were the ones where the ancestral witches usually sat. Everyone looked at the 3 of us with obvious confusion on their faces. They were all wondering the same thing. Why had only 3 come this time? Where were the other ancestral witches? Even before I had fully sat down, Zhenyuanzi and Hongjun directly moved closer. Hongjun asked curiously, where are fellow Taoist Dijiang and the others? I smiled and answered, my brothers and sisters still have other matters to deal with, so they didn't come to this sermon. What else was I supposed to say? That those problem children simply didn't feel like coming to class? That would have been way too embarrassing. Still, both Zhenyuanzi and Hongjun were visibly shocked. Their expressions basically said, what could possibly be more important than hearing the Tao? This time, Hongjun was supposed to explain the cultivation of the quasi-saint realm. It was even more important than the last sermon, but the 2 of them were tactful. Seeing that I clearly had no intention of explaining further, Hongyun didn't press it. Instead, he smiled and said, that's true. After all, you can just tell them what was said once you return. There's no need for everyone to come personally. At that moment, even Kunpeng turned around from the front row. He forced a smile onto his face. It honestly looked worse than when he didn't smile at all, then gave me a slight nod before turning back around. That strange little move of his immediately made Zhenyuanzi and Hongyun even more surprised. Their gazes drifted back to Kunpeng with open curiosity as they kept silently guessing at what exactly had happened between us. Kunpeng's change did not escape Dijun and Taiyi either. Dijun didn't show much on his face and remained calm, but Taiyi frowned and secretly transmitted his voice to Dijun. Big brother, this Kunpeng really doesn't know his place. When we approached him and invited him to join us in building a great cause, his attitude was cold as ice. And yet now he acts like this toward Wutian. That's basically saying he doesn't put us in his eyes at all. His voice was full of dissatisfaction and anger. But Dijun only replied calmly, enough. This is the Purple Dawn Palace. For now, put your mind on hearing the Tao. We'll talk about this after the sermon. Even so, Dijun's eyes quietly shifted toward Fuxi and Nua, and a thought rose faintly in his heart. Before long, the gates of the Purple Dawn Palace closed. Just like last time, Hongjun appeared before everyone without anyone noticing exactly when. His gaze swept across the crowd, and when he saw the missing figures of the ancestral witches, his heart suddenly stirred. At last, this time, things have returned to the original flow of events. According to the heavenly secrets Hongjun had calculated, Dijiang and the others should never have come to hear the Tao in the first place. Their presence last time, although only a small disturbance, had still made him feel a certain pressure. That was what he was thinking, but not a trace of it showed on his face. He remained as detached and indifferent as ever. His gaze did not even pause as it swept through the Purple Dawn Palace before he said calmly, "The second sermon begins." The instant those words fell, boundless Tao rhythm once again spread through the Purple Dawn Palace. Heavenly flowers descended, golden lotuses rose from the earth, and everyone hurriedly listened with full attention. Last time, Hongjun had deliberately stopped right at the crucial point, leaving everyone so itchy with frustration that they wished the next 3,000 years would pass in a blink. As for people like the three pure ones, Fuxi, Nua, Dijun, and Taiyi, they had all awakened their own cultivation methods from the moment they were born. Many of them had already reached Great Luo Golden Immortal long before the first sermon. The first sermon had certainly been useful and had given them great gains, but what they wanted most was not that. What they wanted to know was this: how exactly do you become a quasi-saint? How do you comprehend your own Tao? How do you prove Hunyuan and become a saint? As Hongjun slowly explained, everyone showed different expressions. Some looked suddenly enlightened, some were ecstatic. And inside I quietly sighed. So that really was how it worked. Actually, I had already had some guesses before. Now, as Hongjun explained the Tao, those suspicions were finally being confirmed again. And at the same time, I also began to vaguely understand why the ancestral witches had ended up with their tragic fate in the original course of events. Life, death, dissolution, and in the end, returning everything to heaven and earth. All cultivation paths, at their core, first refine Qi, absorb the energy of heaven and earth, turn it into mana, and strengthen the self. Then, once the cultivator reaches a sufficient level, they begin comprehending laws and engraving the laws of heaven and earth into themselves. The ancestral witches were the same, except their starting point was absurdly high. They were born already controlling one law each, but once it came to advancing into the Hunyuan Golden Immortal Realm, the Wu clan's path and the Immortal Tao became completely different, practically opposites. The Immortal Tao braided many laws together into one's own Tao. The Wu clan, on the other hand, pursued one law all the way to the end and tried to prove the Tao through that single law alone. It wasn't exactly that one was right and the other was wrong. In fact, the ancestral witch's law-proving path was stronger in terms of raw power than the Immortal Tao, but it was also much harder. So hard, in fact, that it was almost impossible to ever succeed. At least under the Heavenly Tao, there was no way the ancestral witches could ever complete that path. No matter how hard they cultivated, they could only stop at the peak of Hunyuan Golden Immortal. They would never be allowed to step beyond that final line. The more fundamental and powerful a law was, the harder it was to perfect. Take Dijiang's space law, for example. How was he supposed to cultivate until he controlled every single aspect of all spatial law in existence? If he actually managed that, then every space law inside the Heavenly Tao would answer to him. At that point, how were other beings supposed to play at all? That was exactly the core of the Heavenly Tao's calculations, especially under a system like the Immortal Tao, where many laws wove together into one's Tao. If the ancestral witches were allowed to completely monopolize any one law, then the Heavenly Tao itself would be left with severe hidden dangers. Naturally, the Heavenly Tao would treat the Wu clan as a mortal threat. After all, who didn't want to control their own fate? That was probably the deepest logic behind why the ancestral witches were schemed against by the Heavenly Tao. If they were ever allowed to truly attain the Tao, then in the Primordial World, who would actually be in charge? As for the later conflict between the Demon Clan and the Wu clan over control of heaven and earth, that was only the surface level reason. At the deeper level, the authorities of life and death, time, space, and so on, all needed to return to the Heavenly Tao in the end. I sighed inwardly and began thinking again. So how exactly could this be changed? Soon, after linking together countless later legends and stories in my memory, I finally came up with a direction. so I stopped dwelling on it and focused fully on listening. As Hongjun continued explaining the Tao, the listeners in the Purple Dawn Palace gradually split into two extremes. One group could follow along and looked radiant with excitement, constantly having breakthroughs in understanding. The weaker group, on the other hand, were all frowning miserably. They could hear every word Hongjun said, but when those words were put together, they understood absolutely nothing. Everything was profound beyond measure, mysterious beyond mystery. Some of them tried to force themselves to memorize it, thinking they would wait until they were strong enough to understand it later. But they quickly discovered they couldn't retain it at all. The moment they stopped thinking about it, it vanished like reflections in a mirror or flowers in water. As for me, I could understand it. I cultivated the 9 revolutions mysterious art, yes, but the divine ability of weaving together the 12 laws of the ancestral witches into the Pangu true body was itself already a heaven-reaching path. All I needed to do was continue engraving laws and strengthen that Pangu true body. Right now, I could only use the phantom of the Pangu true body to envelop myself and borrow the true intent of Pangu for support. But if one day I could directly transform into the true body of Pangu itself, then the moment I achieved Hunyuan, I would have truly succeeded. Naturally, I didn't waste this chance at the sermon. On one hand, I listened carefully to the cultivation of the quasi-saint realm. On the other, I crazily devoured the spiritual energy filling the Purple Dawn Palace and continuously engraved the law power enhanced by the heavenly Tao into both my fleshly body and primordial spirit. Their strength rose faster and faster as I pushed toward a higher realm. Then all of a sudden, Hongjun slowly opened the eyes he had kept half-lidded. His gaze swept over everyone below, deep and unreadable. Even though his sermon was filled with heavenly flowers and brilliant visions, and even though everyone listened as though drunk on it, the number of people who were truly willing to convert to the immortal Tao was ridiculously small. Especially the innate divine beings Hongjun valued the most. Because each of them had their own path, they had no intention at all of throwing themselves wholesale into the immortal Tao. Take the 3 pure ones, for example. They were formed from the split primordial spirit of Pangu. Earlier, on Kunlun Mountain, they had received the 24-petaled creation green lotus. But that lotus was not tolerated by the heavenly Tao. So the moment it appeared, it split apart and transformed into 3 innate spiritual treasures. The Taiji dust whisk, the 3 treasures Jade Rui, and the Qingping sword. Each one represented the Tao of one of the 3 brothers, Pil Tao, Fudu, and Sword Tao. They already had their own roads. Why would they directly throw themselves into the immortal Tao and let Hongjun absorb their destiny and take advantage of them for free? That was why even Tai King, whose cultivation was highest, clearly had the ability at this very moment to directly break through into the quasi-saint realm by following the immortal Tao path, yet still made no move to do so. He was only comprehending the mysteries of the immortal Tao, not actually trying to break through with it. Then there were me, Xuanming, and Houtu. We were even more focused on straightforwardly using the special environment of the Purple Dawn Palace and the Tao rhythm falling from the heavenly Tao to strengthen ourselves. As for me, that was one thing. Hongjun had never expected much from the ancestral witches in the first place. And Houtu, in particular, had opportunities of her own in the future, so there was no chance she would simply switch over to the immortal Tao either. Hongjun was finally beginning to lose his composure a little. Even though, according to the greater trend of the heavenly Tao, the immortal Tao was destined to flourish endlessly, and his own destiny would grow stronger and stronger. At critical moments, he still had to personally push things along. His gaze turned toward Dongwangong and Siwangmu, the 2 innate divine beings born from the key of pure yang and pure yin. These 2 had cultivated separately on Penglai Island and in West Kunlun. A thought moved through Hongjun's mind, and in the next instant, an invisible ripple was born and quietly drifted toward Dongwangong. Dongwangong, who was in the middle of comprehending the methods of immortal Tao cultivation, suddenly felt something stir in his heart. And as Hongjun continued explaining the cultivation methods of the immortal Tao, on the road of proving the Tao through laws, Dongwangong had clearly been feeling lost. As that frustration churned in his heart, he looked up at Hongjun. The immortal Tao was right there in front of him, already laid out and ready to walk. On top of that, Saint Hongjun himself was personally preaching it, which meant the road ahead would be completely open and unobstructed. Why should he keep struggling bitterly on a path so difficult? The moment that thought appeared, he could no longer suppress it. A disturbance instantly rose inside the Purple Dawn Palace. Endless primal energy began gathering toward Dongwangong. Using his innate yang qi as a foundation, the mana around his body began transforming according to the methods of the immortal Tao. As his aura spread outward, the resonance between innate yin and innate yang immediately caused Ziwangmu's power to start circulating too, completely beyond her control. Shuangmu could only curse inwardly, The fool is impossible to plan with. Then she hurriedly calmed herself, and following the countless immortal Tao insights already floating in her heart, also began converting her cultivation. A short while later, the drifting Tao sounds from Hongjun's mouth came to a stop. His gaze turned calm and indifferent as he looked toward Dongwangong and Siwangmu. Everyone else had been drawn out of their own cultivation by the commotion too, and all eyes were fixed on the pair. I was no exception. To me, though, nothing about it felt especially strange. In fact, because of my memories from my previous life, this scene felt almost inevitable. Dongwangong and Ziwangmu had always belonged to the immortal Tao side of things. If anything, they were among the most orthodox of the orthodox. After a little while longer, the two of them completed their cultivation. Their entire path had now been converted into immortal Tao aura, and both of their strengths rose to the late stage of Great Luo Golden Immortal. Based on Dongwangong's own feelings, there were no major obstacles left in his path from here onward. As long as he took some time to cultivate steadily, it wouldn't be hard for him to make another breakthrough and step straight into the quasi-saint realm. Naturally, his face was full of joy. Si Wangmu, on the other hand, had been forced into converting to the immortal Tao, so her expression looked nowhere near as good. She understood very clearly what this meant. The immortal Tao might seem broad and brilliant, but in the end, it meant walking in someone else's footsteps and being confined inside another person's path. If she wanted to achieve truly great things later, the odds would be much harder. And just then, Hongjun suddenly spoke in a calm voice. You two were born from innate yin and yang qi. Now that you belong to my immortal Tao, you shall become the leaders of all male immortals and female immortals beneath heaven. The moment those words fell, the power of the heavenly Tao began to churn inside the Purple Dawn Palace. The title of leader of all male immortals and female immortals was itself a kind of heavenly Tao position. Naturally, it carried thick destiny and allowed its holder to receive the blessing of heavenly Tao power. Soon, as that heavenly Tao force descended, the destiny around the two of them swelled sharply, and even their own strength started trembling as if another rise were about to come. They were on the verge of reaching the peak of Great Luo Golden Immortal. But Hongjun still wasn't done. It was obvious he meant to set them up as examples, spending 1,000 gold on horsebones to draw others in. After bestowing the heavenly Tao positions of leader of male immortals and leader of female immortals, he directly rewarded them with treasures too. Both of them received several spiritual treasures. The most precious treasure Dongwangong obtained was the dragon head cane. Legend. Said Hongjun himself had used it before, proving the Tao. Now he handed it to Dongwangong as the symbol of the leader of male immortals under heaven. As for Siwangmu, she received even more direct benefits. Hongjun bestowed upon her the top-grade innate spiritual treasure, the Western plain-colored cloud banner for self-defense, and also gave her an innate flat peach tree to help suppress and stabilize her destiny. Originally, Siwangmu had still been carrying a good amount of resentment in her heart, but after receiving that, most of it immediately faded away. Both of them respectfully bowed together toward Hongjun and said in unison, "Many thanks, Saint Hongjun." Dongwangong in particular was all smiles. Not only was he satisfied with his choice, he had also suddenly realized something huge. With the title of leader of male immortals in hand and the dragon head cane as a symbol of authority, didn't that effectively make him the spokesperson of the immortal Tao in the primordial world? Countless thoughts instantly surged through his mind. After a brief pause, he even raised his voice and said, "Please rest assured, Saint Hongjun. We will certainly cultivate diligently and use the immortal Tao to enlighten the living beings of the primordial world. We will make sure the teachings of the immortal Tao flourish and its destiny prosper." The moment everyone else saw that, all kinds of thoughts stirred in their hearts. Some of the less steady-minded among them even wished they had been the ones to step forward first. If they had done that, then maybe they could have received heavenly Tao positions and treasures too. Right then, Dijun suddenly stood up and asked, "May I ask Saint Hongjun this? Among the many paths of the primordial world, is it only through the immortal Tao that one may prove the Tao and become a saint?" At those words, everyone was instantly shaken. Light flashed in their eyes. What Dijun had asked was exactly what all of them wanted to know too. Even if he had not stood up, someone else would have sooner or later. Hongjun's gaze became deep and unreadable for a moment. Then he calmly said, "No. The 3,000 great Taoists may all lead to sainthood. One is not limited to the immortal Tao alone." "Very well. I possess a treasure called the Jade Butterfly of Creation. It records the many great Taoists of heaven and earth after the creation of the world. Those among you who have the proper affinity may each go and comprehend for yourselves." The moment he said that, the Jade Butterfly of Creation above his head rose into the air and released boundless light. At once, strange phenomena emerged. Countless great Taoists were born and died within that light, cycling endlessly. Then the Jade Butterfly gave a violent tremor, and all those Tao marks shot through the Purple Dawn Palace like a sky full of stars, dazzling to the eyes. Everyone who had been sitting there upright immediately moved. One after another, beams of spiritual light shot upward toward the 3,000 Tao marks. Primordial spirit power spread out along threads of resonance, each person searching for the Tao most suited to themselves. Naturally, I was no exception. I didn't even have time to keep watching Dongwanggong and Siwangmu. I immediately focused my mind, looked upward, and sent out my soul force. In an instant, it wrapped around a faintly glowing Tao mark and pulled it down. Then I began comprehending it at top speed. The mysteries within it were the Tao of the fleshly body. No wonder I had felt such strong resonance with it. But what surprised me was that the laws contained in that mark were terribly incomplete. Very soon, I had already comprehended everything it held, and then the mark flew back into the void. That made sense too. The jade butterfly of creation might be a supreme treasure, but there was no way it could fully record all 3,000 great Taos in perfect detail. If it could, that would be far too heaven-defying. Just being able to engrave incomplete Tao marks like this was already amazing enough. I naturally didn't waste any time. I followed the resonance in my soul again and reached for another Tao mark. Very soon I caught another one, and this time it was the Tao of the world. This was the path of opening a world within oneself, then constantly perfecting and strengthening that world until it grew step by step. In some ways, it resembled what Pangu had done in opening heaven and earth. But Pangu had taken a direct, overwhelming route. His strength had been enough to create one of the highest tier worlds in the chaos in a single step. The Tao of the world, however, was a path of gradual advancement. I didn't reject it at all. I hurriedly engraved this world Tao into my soul too. Whether I chose to cultivate it or not in the future, it was still an extremely valuable reserve. But just as I finished comprehending it and was about to move again, Hongjun's voice suddenly sounded through the hall. The time has come. The second sermon is over. In 3,000 years, I will give the final sermon and explain to you the method of proving the Tao and becoming a saint. The moment those words fell, the jade butterfly of creation floating in the void gave a great tremor. Instantly, all the countless beams of spiritual light and Tao marks vanished, then flew back toward Hongjun. Everyone's faces were full of reluctance. And then, right at that moment, a thought suddenly rose in Dongwanggong's mind. He abruptly opened his mouth and said with a genial smile, "Saint Hongjun has preached the immortal Tao for us, and today has even selflessly revealed the 3,000 great Taos. In the future, all the paths of the primordial world will come from the saint. He should be called the ancestor of all Tao." Before anyone else could react, Dongwanggong directly bowed and said loudly, "Many thanks to Tao ancestor Hongjun for preaching in the Purple Dawn Palace with a heart of great compassion and enlightening all living beings of the primordial world." For a split second, the entire hall went dumb. What the hell? That was one shameless level of flattery. Since when had Saint Hongjun suddenly become Tao ancestor Hongjun? Now, if all the paths under heaven had truly come from Hongjun, then calling him Tao ancestor would have made some sense. But was that actually the case? Obviously not. Leaving aside the fact that the Tao marks in the jade butterfly of creation were incomplete, many of the innate sacred beings present already had their own path within themselves to begin with. They had not gotten those from Hongjun at all. So what exactly made him Tao ancestor? But Dongwanggong had chosen to say it here, inside the Purple Dawn Palace itself, right in the middle of Hongjun's own sermon. What were the others supposed to do now? They couldn't very well jump up and shout that Hongjun was unworthy of the title. After a brief silence, voices finally began sounding in the Purple Dawn Palace again. In the end, everyone had no choice but to follow Dongwanggong's lead and say, "We thank Tao ancestor Hongjun." The three of us, of course, said nothing. Still, I had no intention of jumping out to make trouble over it either. I only looked at the crowd with a half smile. The ancestral witches inherited their legacy directly from Pangu. What did Hongjun have to do with us? Naturally, we had no reason to acknowledge him as any so-called Tao ancestor. Hongjun, however, didn't mind that in the slightest. At that moment, a faint smile appeared on his face. Most of his attention had already gone inward, because as the cry of Tao ancestor spread through the hall, a vast and surging wave of destiny descended onto him. The jade butterfly of creation spun rapidly, and even his authority within the heavenly Tao rose sharply. Hongjun chuckled lightly and said, "There is no need for excessive courtesy. This is only as it should be." As he spoke, he gave Dongwanggong a nod. That one nod alone made Dongwanggong feel as though he had swallowed honey. The smile on his face became even more radiant. After that, Hongjun directly withdrew. "This sermon is over. In 3,000 years, the Purple Dawn Palace will open again, and I will explain the method of proving the Tao and becoming a saint." Just like last time, Hongjun ended right at the most crucial point. A complete master of cliffhangers. In the end, Hongjun had gained the title of Tao ancestor. His authority in the heavenly Tao had risen sharply, and his strength would naturally grow with it. Dongwanggong and Siwangmu, meanwhile, had each received heavenly Tao positions, and now held the authority to command the immortals of the world. Dijun narrowed his eyes slightly and studied Dong Wanggong. At that same moment, some cultivators had already begun walking over to flatter him. Their words were full of congratulations. Fellow Taoist Mugong has received the Tao Ancestor's personal appointment. In the future, you will surely govern the immortal Tao of the Primordial World, truly worthy of celebration. Dong Wanggong was originally called Mugong because he had been born alongside the Tongtian Jianmu, one of the 10 great innate spiritual roots. That was also why Hongjun Daozu had given a flat peach tree to Xiwangmu to balance things out. With so many people flattering him, Dong Wanggong began to feel more and more buoyant inside. Still, he forcefully suppressed his pride and maintained a modest appearance as he cupped his hands with a smile. You all flatter me. Since Tao Ancestor has bestowed this position upon me, I naturally cannot do nothing. After I return to Penglai, I plan to follow Tao Ancestor's example and preach the immortal Tao to living beings there. If any of you have free time, you are most welcome to come and join. Immediately, some people started nodding. Of course, we'll go. We also want to hear fellow Taoist Mugong's understanding of the immortal Tao. Dong Wanggong's heart felt better and better. Then a thought struck him, and he quickly turned to look for Xiwangmu. Since the two of them had respectively become the leaders of male and female immortals, he couldn't exactly perform a one-man show, could he? But Xiwangmu was already nowhere to be seen. Dong Wanggong hurriedly looked toward the gates of the Purple Dawn Palace and saw her back just as she was exiting, turning into a streak of light that shot into the chaos outside. Fellow Taoist Xiwangmu? He cried out in surprise, then instantly seemed to realize something. He hurriedly turned back, apologized to those around him, and immediately chased after her. Seeing that, Dijun couldn't help sneering faintly. Only then did he withdraw his gaze and let out a cold hum. From Dong Wanggong's words and actions, Dijun had naturally already seen through him. The moment Dong Wanggong obtained the title of Leader of Male Immortals, his ambition had already started showing itself. Leader of Male Immortals? At most, just a gatekeeping dog. That was what Dijun thought to himself, before shifting his gaze toward Fuxi and Nuwa and beginning to calculate inwardly. My own attention naturally also moved away from Xiwangmu's departing back and toward Nuwa's side. But the moment I had just looked over once, I suddenly felt someone slap my arm. I turned around and saw Xuanming's cold, peerlessly beautiful face right in front of me. She was staring at me and asking, "So which one is prettier, Xiwangmu or Nuwa?" I was instantly stunned. What was going on? How could words like that possibly come out of Xuanming's cold little mouth? It was almost impossible to believe. Under my shocked gaze, a trace of panic flashed across Xuanming's face, but she quickly forced herself to calm down and said, "What? Did I say something wrong? After Hongjun finished preaching, I saw you staring at Xiwangmu the whole time. You only reluctantly pulled your eyes away after she had already left the Purple Dawn Palace. And then without stopping for even a moment, you immediately started staring at Nuwa. At that, I almost cried injustice on the spot. This was a massive misunderstanding. The reason I had been watching Xiwangmu was because she had just received the Western Plain-colored cloud banner. Hadn't I already been thinking about collecting the 5 innate banners before? Of course I was going to pay attention to where one of them had gone. Alright, yes, Xiwangmu really was beautiful too. Every innate sacred being in the primordial world was close to perfection, but each of them had their own unique style. And Xiwangmu's noble grace, along with that slight lazy elegance between her brows, I couldn't deny it. That really did land right in my strike zone. But that wasn't the point here. As for Nuwa, the reason I looked over there was because Dijun had started walking toward Fuxi and Nuwa. According to the original course of events, this was about the time when Dijun, Taiyi, Fuxi, and Nuwa should begin joining forces to establish the demon clan. Naturally, I had to pay close attention to that too. So I quickly sent a voice transmission and explained everything to Xuanming. Her expression immediately relaxed, and she subconsciously asked, "Really?" Then she looked toward Dijun and the others and asked, "Then what are we going to do?" The thought of stopping them had never even crossed her mind. In Xuanming's eyes, a demon clan that had not even properly appeared yet was no threat at all. I glanced at the 4 of them once more and said, "Let's hurry back. Didn't I already tell my brothers and sisters we need to move fast? We can't let others get ahead of us." Then I directly stood up. At that moment, Zhenyuanzi and Hongyun hurried over again. Judging by their expressions, they were clearly about to invite me to 5 Villages Temple once more to discuss the Tao and taste ginseng fruit. Naturally, I had no time for that now. So I beat them to it and said, "Fellow Taoist Zhenyuanzi, fellow Taoist Hongyun, my Wu clan is about to handle a major matter next. If the 2 of you have the time, why not come with me to the Wu clan for a visit? You can also serve as witnesses." The 2 of them froze for a moment, then exchanged looks. Soon after, Zhenyuanzi smiled and said, "Naturally, that would be fine. After all, the 2 of them had no great ambitions to begin with. They only wanted to roam freely between heaven and earth, and 5 Villages Temple had no urgent matters requiring them. Naturally, they were willing to come along." A thought stirred in my heart, and I turned to look toward Kunpeng. This time, Kunpeng had not slipped away in advance. Instead, He was still sitting where he was with a thoughtful expression, as though he were still digesting the Tao he had just comprehended from the jade butterfly of creation. Because of the earlier matter of the Northern Black Abyss water-controlling banner, I could already be considered to have formed a bit of goodwill with him. And on top of that, I had begun to suspect that Kunpeng might not be exactly the way I had always imagined him. So I simply extended an invitation to him as well. Sure, in the original course of events he belonged to the demon side, but his position had never actually been that firm. If I could pull him a little toward us, then under this kind of shifting balance, wouldn't that be a double gain for me? So I smiled and invited him too. After hearing me out, Kunpeng didn't refuse immediately. He thought for a moment, then forced out another awkward smile and said, "I won't go with you now. But on the day fellow Taoist speaks of, I will certainly come and offer my congratulations." After saying that, he stood up and cupped his hand slightly toward Xuanming, Houtu, Zhenyuanzi, and Hongjun, then headed for the exit of the Purple Dawn Palace. Once Kunpeng was gone, Hongjun let out a light breath and said, "Fellow Taoist Kunpeng really doesn't seem easy to get along with. He always looks like he can't be bothered to give anyone a decent expression. Every time I see him, it feels a little strange. And yet he treats fellow Taoists so differently?" His eyes sparkled and his face turned openly gossipy. "So, fellow Taoist Wutian, how did you do it? What happened between you and Kunpeng?" I didn't mind at all. I only laughed lightly and said, "Nothing much. Earlier, didn't my brothers and sisters step in against those two from the west?" Kunpeng more or less kept his seat because of that too, so he felt he owed a favor. Later, he came and offered the Northern Black Abyss water-controlling banner to settle the karma. One thing led to another, and now you could say we have a bit of acquaintance. After saying that, I directly called everyone to come with me and headed toward the exit of the Purple Dawn Palace. Right now, I was anxious to get back and discuss the founding of the clan with Dijing and the others. Xuanming and Houtu followed at my sides, while Zhenyuanzi and Hongyun followed behind us. The two of them kept exchanging odd looks, clearly communicating with their eyes. Zhenyuanzi was practically thinking out loud. If even Kunpeng had handed over the Northern Black Abyss water-controlling banner to settle karma, then what exactly were the two of them supposed to do? They couldn't very well show nothing at all, could they? But Zhenyuanzi was also deeply troubled. Kunpeng had only indirectly benefited from the Wu clan's help, while he and Hongyun had been the most direct beneficiaries of all. I had personally stepped in for them, yet he had no extra innate spiritual treasures he could offer. He couldn't very well just hand over the Earth Book, could he? Once we exited the Purple Dawn Palace, Xuanming and Hutu's auras moved at once. Vast law power immediately surged around them. Without needing to say anything, the two of them were already preparing to split open the chaos and carry me back. But before they could, Hongyun stepped forward with a smile. "Let me do it. I'm very fast when it comes to traveling. After all, he still owed me a favor. It really would have been a little shameless for him to keep letting Xuanming and Houtu do all the work." So Hongyun directly volunteered. Xuanming and Houtu stopped and looked over at him curiously. I wasn't surprised at all. Back during the first Purple Dawn Palace sermon, Zhenyuanzi and Hongyun had arrived extremely early. Naturally, that meant the two of them were fast. At that moment, Zhenyuanzi smiled and added, "To be honest, fellow Taoists may not know this, but Hongyun is the very first red cloud born when heaven and earth opened." In terms of travel speed, I won't say he's absolutely the top of the Primordial World, but he's definitely among the fastest. By then, Hongyun had already opened a barrier glowing with mysterious red light. The aura it released was extremely profound. The moment I sensed it, I couldn't help marveling inwardly. No wonder Hongyun had such outrageous fortune. Among the four primordial aspects of world opening, earth, water, fire, and wind, Hongyun alone actually occupied 3 of them. He only lacked earth. At that point, Zhenyuanzi smiled too and said, "I'll help him a little." As he spoke, he sent out a stream of mana. It was the power of the Earth Book, carrying rich innate earth ki mixed with traces of innate wood force. Once it merged with Hongyun's mana, and then fused with the powers of water, fire, and wind among the 4 opening aspects. The original 5-element power transformed directly into the power of the 4 aspects. With a flash, the barrier changed. What had been a red barrier instantly turned gray and misty like chaos itself, almost as if a tiny world had been carved out inside the chaos, cutting off all the surrounding chaotic ki. Seeing that, my eyes lit up at once. No wonder the two of you brothers get along so well. So there really is this kind of complementary harmony between you. After joking about it, I immediately stepped into the gray barrier. Xuanming and Houtu, seeing that things had become easier, naturally didn't object. They followed me in. Then the 5 of us broke through the chaos and headed toward the Primordial World. Since I was traveling together with Zhenyuanzi and Hongyun now, it wasn't appropriate for me to simply close my eyes and cultivate. So instead, I started chatting with them. Xuanming and Houtu quietly listened from the side. And since we had just come out of the Purple Dawn Palace, the natural topic of conversation quickly turned toward Dongwanggong and Xiwangmu? Hongjun asked curiously. From what I saw, Xiwangmu didn't seem very willing to convert to the immortal Tao, otherwise she wouldn't have hurried off without even paying attention to Dongwangong. The moment that topic came up, everyone instantly got a little gossipy. Even Xuanming and Houtu started listening with obvious interest. After chatting for a while about Dongwangong and Xiwangmu, Zhen Yuanzi suddenly sighed. Still, Dongwangong's choice may not actually have been wrong. The path of proving the Tao through laws is just too difficult. When a ready-made immortal Tao is placed right in front of you, making that choice is completely understandable. The immortal Tao is built on the 5-element laws. Once the 5 QE in the chest are perfected and the laws reach balance, they naturally form a complete whole, and at that point one gains the power to step beyond the 5 elements. That's why immortals are called the thieves of the 5 elements. Someone like me, born from innate earth essence and innate wood ki, naturally possesses 5-element laws within my very foundation. So the immortal Tao is especially suitable for me. Then he shook his head and sighed again. But in the end, walking someone else's Tao still means being restricted by someone else. When I think about it, I just can't feel reconciled. That was, in truth, the mindset of most of the listeners in the Purple Dawn Palace. That was why the reaction had been so intense when Dongwangong and Xiwangmu converted to the immortal Tao. Although Hongjun Daozu had later released the 3,000 Great Taos for everyone to study, how many people could truly find the Tao most suited to themselves? And on top of that, those Tao marks were incomplete to begin with. The moment I heard Zhen Yuanzi sigh, my heart moved. After all, I knew very well that Zhen Yuanzi would later become the ancestor of Earth Immortals. He would even carve out an entirely new branch of cultivation for himself. Though still technically a kind of immortal path, it would be its own system, its own school, making him the founder and ancestor of a distinct tradition. Once I thought of that, I stopped holding back and directly smiled. Why should fellow Taoists be troubled? The Earth Book in your hand is an extremely profound treasure. There is a great Tao hidden within it. If you can comprehend it, wouldn't that also be an opportunity to prove the Tao? Saints entrust their primordial spirits to the heavenly Tao. But you, why can't you entrust your primordial spirit to the Earth Book instead? Zhen Yuanzi's eyes instantly lit up, but I still wasn't done. Thinking of how the future Zhen Yuanzi would use the Earth Book to open the Earth Immortal realm, I decided to go one step further and share my own comprehension of the world Tao with him. With a flash, a ball of mysterious light flew out from my spiritual platform. This is the world Tao I comprehended from the jade butterfly of creation. It may be of some help to fellow Taoist. You might as well study it carefully. The expression on Zhen Yuanzi's face turned into a mix of shock and joy, but I only laughed and said, there's no need to worry. Insights into Tao and law aren't the kind of thing where if I give them to you, I lose them myself. If fellow Taoists gain something useful later, just share a part with me in return. I only feel a little regret because I'm from the Wu clan, so I'm not particularly strong in this sort of Tao comprehension. It's possible my understanding of the world Tao is incomplete in some places, so fellow Taoists should keep that in mind. Zhen Yuanzi's expression changed several times. He was obviously tempted by the world Tao, but he also felt awkward. The favor I had already done for him and Hongjun earlier had not been repaid yet, and now he was going to accept another major benefit from me? After a long silence, Zhen Yuanzi finally cupped his hands solemnly and bowed. In that case, Zhen Yuan will shamelessly accept it. For now, I have no way to repay this. I will remember this in my heart. If fellow Taoist ever needs something from me, all you need to do is ask. I only smiled and nodded. After that, Zhen Yuanzi stopped hesitating. He directly absorbed the world Tao comprehension into his primordial spirit. A glow immediately spread around his whole body as he entered deep contemplation. Not long after that, even the Earth Book flew out of his body on its own and hovered above his head, continuously releasing yellow, earth-colored light. Seeing this, the others all kept quiet and did not disturb him. Hongjun, meanwhile, poured even more strength into the barrier, and our small sphere of light continued crushing through the chaotic key, flashing through the chaos on its way back toward the primordial world. By the time we tore through the chaotic Taimo and entered the primordial world proper, the Earth Book above Zhen Yuanzi's head suddenly flashed, drawing all its light back in before sinking into his body. A moment later, Zhen Yuanzi slowly opened his eyes. They were shining with unmistakable joy. Under the curious gazes of everyone else, Zhen Yuanzi smiled and said, I understand now. I've found my own Tao. Following the logic I had just pointed out, the difference between a saint and an ordinary Hunyuan Great Luo lay in whether one's primordial spirit was entrusted to the heavenly Tao, allowing one to coexist with it and become undying and indestructible. But the Earth Book was linked to the great earth of the primordial world. As long as the primordial world's earth endured, the Earth Book would not perish. Wasn't that simply another form of undying and indestructible? It was another road entirely, another way of proving the Tao, and more than that, Zhen Yuanzi could even spread this path outward. If others were willing to cultivate it too, They could also entrust their primordial spirits in the same way and strengthen themselves through it. Though many details were still unclear, Zhenyuanzi had already seen the road clearly, so he immediately gave me a deep salute. Many thanks for fellow Taoists' guidance. Even as he spoke, Zhenyuanzi was sighing inwardly without end. He had already owed me huge karma before. Now, because of my guidance, he had even understood his own Tao. The karma had become even heavier. This favor? There was no way he could ever finish repaying it. At the level of a favor related to attaining the Tao, a few simple words of thanks were almost meaningless. Zhenyuanzi understood that clearly, so he only said one sentence aloud and quietly recorded everything in his heart, already making up his mind that he would definitely repay me properly one day. When Hongjun saw that Zhenyuanzi had understood his own Tao through my guidance, he clearly became restless too. Though he looked embarrassed, he still couldn't help glancing at me expectantly. At that, I could only go speechless for a moment. What was I supposed to say to him? I couldn't exactly tell him, why don't you go die first, then reincarnate as Sheneng and attain the Tao that way. Besides, because of my interference, the whole matter of giving up the Purple Dawn Palace seat had already changed drastically. Whether Hongjun would still walk the same path as in the original course of events remained uncertain. Still, Hongjun himself already occupied 3 of the 4 primordial aspects. That kind of foundation was absurdly strong. As long as he could gather the final remaining force and complete the 4-aspect cycle, he would naturally be able to build his own Tao. So after thinking for a moment, I smiled and said, fellow Taoist might consider a path centered on completing your own laws. That world Tao I gave to Zhenyuanzi, fellow Taoist should study it too. Perhaps it will give you some inspiration. Hongjun immediately nodded, carefully suppressing the excitement in his heart. Under my guidance, the group of us headed toward the Wu clan at the foot of Mount Buzhou. Suddenly, 2 terrifying columns of baleful aura shot upward and instantly blocked Hongyun's path. Dijiang and Jujuyin appeared in midair and roared in anger, clearly ready to strike. Who goes there? Hongjun and Zhenyuanzi hurriedly released their own power. The 4-aspect force around them immediately dispersed, and the auras of our group became clear. Only then did Dijiang and Jujuyin stop, letting out a small sound of surprise. After dropping down, Dijiang even curiously circled Hongjun with his eyes for a moment, before laughing. Didn't expect this. For someone with such a soft personality, you can actually control the power of the 4 aspects. Not bad. Not bad. The reason they had charged out so suddenly was because the 4-aspect circulation had blended so perfectly that it had hidden all of our auras almost completely. At Dijiang's words, Hongjun instantly looked helpless. He had no idea whether to laugh or not. But he also knew the ancestral witches were simply like this by nature, so he didn't get angry. I immediately stepped in and said, Brother, fellow Taoists, Zhenyuanzi and Hongjun were invited by me as witnesses. Then I turned toward Zhenyuanzi and Hongjun. Back in the Purple Dawn Palace, there had been a lot I couldn't explain too clearly. But now that we had reached the Wu clan, once we got back onto our own turf, I directly gave them a simple explanation of our plan. We were going to formally announce the Wu clan before Father God Pangu, and at the same time, work Mount Buzhou itself into the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation. Zhenyuanzi and Hongjun exchanged glances. But very quickly, Zhenyuanzi, who in the future would practically become the first person in the primordial world to come up with a grand, moral blackmail formation style of defense, seemed to catch my meaning. He smiled and looked at me. Our eyes met, and both of us showed the kind of smile that could be understood without being spoken aloud. Zhenyuanzi didn't mind it at all. If anything, he looked like he had run into a kindred spirit. The reason he had created the Earth Book formation in the first place was simple. He feared people might eventually come knocking at his door. Even though he and Hongjun had good reputations and never took the initiative to provoke trouble, their strength was still limited and their temperaments were too gentle. Sooner or later, that made it easy for others to bully them. That was why he had developed such ideas. But the Wu clan was different. The ancestral witches were overbearing and absurdly powerful. So why would we also be thinking along those lines? That could only mean one thing. We were clearly preparing for something. Zhenyuanzi turned that over in his mind for a while, but when he couldn't figure it out, he simply stopped trying to dig deeper. Instead, he smiled and said, as it happens, I have a little experience in this area. If fellow Taoists don't mind, I can explain the structure of my Earth Book formation so everyone can use it as a reference. Because of the favor the Wu clan had shown him and Hongjun, Zhenyuanzi immediately made that decision. In his heart, he was already thinking of it as a way to repay at least part of the karma he owed. The moment I heard that, I was both shocked and delighted. The Earth Book formation was one of Zhenyuanzi's life-saving trump cards. It was one of his deepest secrets, and yet he was actually willing to share it. I thought about it for a moment, and in the end, I didn't refuse. Instead, I answered solemnly, "Many thanks, fellow Taoist Zhenyuanzi." Zhenyuanzi also looked genuinely pleased. At last, he could finally help me with something. That alone made him feel much more comfortable. Otherwise, if he kept owing me favor after favor like this, it might eventually even start affecting his Tao heart. Jiang and the others were equally pleased. The way they looked at Zhen Yuanzi and Hongjun instantly became warmer and warmer, as though the more they looked, the more agreeable the two of them seemed. Jiang even walked right up and gave Hongyun a heavy slap on the shoulder. Ha ha ha. From now on, you two are friends of the Wu clan. If anyone dares bully you, just report the name of our Wu clan. Hongyun clearly wasn't very used to Jiang's enthusiasm, but he also understood that he and old brother Zhen Yuanzi had truly won the Ancestral Witch's recognition now. His spirits rose at once, and the smile on his face became much freer and brighter. Soon after, we all went together to Pangu Hall. The other Ancestral Witches heard the news and came over one after another. Before Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun could even say anything, Jiang loudly announced, "These two are friends of our Wu clan." The Ancestral Witches immediately became extremely warm toward them. I had originally wanted to first entertain the two of them properly, but Zhen Yuanzi only smiled and waved it off. Business comes first. With that, he went straight into the explanation. The Earth Book appeared before him, radiating yellow-brown light. On its surface, lines and nodes spread outward in every direction, displaying themselves before the Ancestral Witches. Those lines represented the flow of the earth veins of the Primordial World, while the glowing points were the great blessed lands and spiritual nodes where spiritual energy gathered thickest. Zhen Yuanzi began explaining slowly and in detail. And not only that, after finishing the basics, even though he did not know the exact structure of the 12 Heavenly Gods Fiend formation, he still used his own deductions to offer suggestions. The Ancestral Witches all listened with full concentration. Since the 12 Heavenly Gods Fiend formation already existed in their bloodline inheritance as a point of reference, none of them lost focus at all. In fact, they were listening much more seriously than they ever had inside the Purple Dawn Palace. I memorized everything carefully too. At the same time, countless insights were being born in my heart. The 12 kinds of law power inside my soul kept surging and shifting. Right then, Houtu quietly nudged me from the side and secretly transmitted her voice. So that's how it is. Before, I was still wondering why you were treating these two brothers so well for no reason. Turns out you had already planned all this in advance. The Earth Book formation really is incredibly subtle. Because she had listened to Zhen Yuanzi's explanation, Houtu had gained a great deal more understanding regarding the 12 Heavenly Gods Fiend formation, so she said that with a lively tone full of admiration. I immediately cried injustice. Houtuji, this time you really are misunderstanding me. I truly didn't think of it that way in the beginning. I definitely wasn't targeting the Earth Book formation. My original plan had only been to interfere with the seat opportunities in the Purple Dawn Palace. Back during our first visit, Hongjun had directly interfered because he was afraid the Ancestral Witches would seize too many seats. Since he cared that much, how could I possibly let him have an easy time? Of course I had to disrupt his arrangements. On top of that, Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun really did live up to their reputations as the Primordial World's good old nice guys. Getting along with them felt genuinely comfortable, and there was no need to worry about future trouble from them. But naturally, none of that was easy to explain clearly right now. So even though I denied it, Houtu still didn't believe me. Instead, her eyes looked even more pleased and gratified, as though she were extremely satisfied by my careful, long-term planning. Seeing that, I simply gave up arguing. Fine, think whatever you want. As long as we could hurry up and improve the formation and bind Mount Buzhou into it, I didn't care how they interpreted my motives. Once Zhen Yuanzi finished his explanation, all of the Ancestral Witches had gained a lot. Every one of them wore a thoughtful expression. Zhejiang in particular looked overjoyed. The 12 Heavenly Gods Fiend formation was the supreme formation inherited in their bloodline from Father God Pangu. Modifying it was naturally no simple matter. During this period, the Ancestral Witches had not been lazy at all, but there were still many places where they had been stuck. Now, after borrowing ideas from the Earth Book formation, many of the doubts they had been carrying were instantly resolved. The Ancestral Witches all turned to look at Zhen Yuanzi, their eyes bright enough to burn. That made both Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun a little confused. Zhen Yuanzi cautiously asked, "Fellow Taoist Dijiang, is there something different?" But Dijiang suddenly burst into laughter. "Ha ha ha! From now on, stop calling us fellow Taoist. From now on, you're brothers of our Wu clan, brother Zhen Yuanzi, brother Hongyun." The moment they heard that, both of them smiled too. They didn't fuss over who had spoken first. They simply laughed and replied, "Brother Dijiang." Then they turned and looked at me as well. "Brother Wuqian." I felt happy too, but at the same time I couldn't help sighing inwardly. Who exactly was it that kept saying the Ancestral Witches had no brains? Wasn't Big Brother Dijiang handling this beautifully? Just one word, brother, and the two of them were practically smiling so hard their mouths could barely close. And honestly, they really were flattered. It wasn't because the Ancestral Witches' status was somehow unbelievably exalted. Sure, they were Pangu Orthodox, but Zhen Yuanzi and Hongyun's own backgrounds weren't lacking either, so they didn't care much about things like rank or pedigree. What mattered was reputation. The whole primordial world knew the ancestral witches were hard-tempered, stubborn, fiercely protective of their own, and extremely hostile to outsiders. Back in the Purple Dawn Palace, they hadn't even shown much respect to Hongjun Daozu himself. For people like that to call someone brother was truly rare. So Dijiang no longer treated Genuanzi and Hongyun like outsiders. He directly started discussing the matters of the 12 Heavenly Gods Fiend formation and the formal founding of the Wu clan right in front of them. The ancestral witches might not mind anymore, but Genuanzi and Hongyun immediately felt awkward. They quickly turned to me and said, "Brother Wuqian, these are internal affairs of the Wu clan. We really shouldn't participate. Besides, because of your guidance earlier, we already gained many insights in our hearts, and we'd like to properly consolidate them. Why don't we cultivate for a while first?" After the two of them insisted several times, I finally smiled and said, "Fine. There just happens to be a place on Mount Buzhou suitable for the two of you to cultivate. I'll take you there." The place I meant was naturally the mountain valley where the innate gourd vine was hidden. Pangahal had its own inner space, yes, but the baleful aura there was much too dense. Genuanzi and Hongyun ultimately cultivated clear and pure spiritual qi, so the environment there did not suit them. Cultivating there would naturally be far inferior to cultivating near the innate gourd vine. On top of that, the valley itself was full of spiritual energy and rich in law power. With the roots of the innate gourd vine there as well, it might even inspire Genuanzi in some additional way. The moment I explained that, the ancestral witches immediately understood what I was referring to. They all felt it was very appropriate and nodded with smiles. So I led the two of them there. When the three of us descended outside the valley, strange surprise and curiosity appeared on Genuanzi and Hongyun's faces as they looked around at the empty-looking scenery before them. There was nothing obviously special in sight. Just then, Xingtian stepped out from a concealed spot and saluted. "Greetings, Ancestral Witch Lord." The instant they heard that, light flashed in Genuanzi and Hongyun's eyes. Until now, they had never been completely certain what my exact identity was. At this point, hearing Xingtian address me that way, they finally got their answer. Ancestral Witch, so I really was one. Otherwise, how could I have called Di Jiang and the others brothers? But in the very next moment, the two of them grew puzzled again. Weren't there supposed to be only 12 ancestral witches? Then what exactly was I? I didn't pay any attention to the change in their expressions, and I didn't care whether they knew my identity now either. I only smiled at Xingtian and said, "Xingtian, you've worked hard. You don't need to keep guard here anymore. Head back to the tribe first." Then I smiled and patted Xingtian on the shoulder in encouragement. That was something I had learned directly from Dijiang. I kept saying I should reward these great witches properly, but the truth was, I really didn't have anything suitable on hand. So for now, all I could do was offer some spiritual encouragement first. Still, I had already made up my mind. Based on the merit Xingtian had earned by guarding the innate gourd vine for me, there was no way I would let him become the future headless warman from the original course of events. Xingtian didn't understand what I was planning, but he didn't ask a single question. Everyone already said that I was the smartest among all the ancestral witch lords, so whatever I did naturally had my reasons. At once he nodded with a cheerful smile, as the ancestral witch lord commands. "I'll return first then. If the ancestral witch lord has any further instructions, just summon me." After sending Xingtian away, I raised my hand under Genuanzi and Hongyun's astonished gazes and lightly tapped the empty air before us. With a flash, 7-colored light appeared. The great formation that concealed the valley finally revealed itself and silently opened a passage in front of the three of us. "Brother Genuanzi, Brother Hongyun, this way." I made a welcoming gesture. The two of them immediately stepped into the formation with me. The instant they entered, shock filled their eyes. Inside the valley, spiritual energy was so dense that it had almost gathered into a lake. The entire hidden space was alive with spiritual essence. That alone would have been impressive enough, though not beyond anything they had seen before. But the moment the innate gourd vine entered their sight, their eyes locked onto it and could not move away for a very long time. Innate spiritual root, innate yin, yang, and 5 elements? How is this possible? Genuanzi couldn't help crying out in shock. Because of his own nature, he knew more about innate spiritual roots than most beings in the primordial world. And yet even he had never imagined that a spiritual root could exist which gathered yin, yang, and all 5 elements into one. His own ginseng fruit tree was an earth aspect innate spiritual root. Junti's original body, the Bodhi tree, was a metal aspect innate spiritual root. The Fusang tree on the Sun Star was an innate fire aspect spiritual root. To possess just one innate law was already incredibly rare and powerful. But the thing before us contained innate yin, innate yang, and the 5 elements all at once. When Genuanzi saw the way the innate gourd vine's aura resonated and blended with mine, he instantly understood that this spiritual root had already recognized me as its master. He couldn't help blurting out, "Brother Wuqian, your luck really is outrageous." His envy was written plainly across his face. I immediately laughed. Ha ha ha, Brother Genuanzi, don't you also have the ginseng fruit tree? That's one of the top 10 innate spiritual roots, too. There was no need to even speak of how precious the innate gourd vine was. In the original course of events, even the gourds that had not fully matured still became famous treasures throughout the entire primordial world. That alone showed how heaven-defying they were. But after hearing my words, a bitter expression unexpectedly appeared on Genuanzi's face, as though he had been reminded of his own background. Since matters of one's origin were private in the primordial world, I naturally couldn't casually ask. Then something happened that genuinely surprised me. Genuanzi let out a soft sigh and looked at the innate gourd vine with a trace of pity in his eyes. Alas, this innate gourd vine is indeed extraordinary. But little brother, you should also be careful. Under the heavenly Tao, how could something this perfect be allowed to exist? Sooner or later, I fear a tribulation will come for it. And if it cannot pass that tribulation... As he spoke, Genuanzi slowly shook his head. At that moment, the innate gourd vine seemed to sense his feelings as well. Its countless leaves rustled softly, and a branch even climbed over and wrapped itself around me. My heart immediately tightened. Genuanzi was right. In the original course of events, the innate gourd vine really had met disaster. Before it could even fully mature, it had been cut apart and divided up. But now things were different. My eyes instantly sharpened. Many thanks for the reminder, Brother Genuanzi. I know very well that a spiritual root this complete is naturally something heaven and earth would find hard to tolerate. But since it has already recognized me as its master, then I will protect it. If anyone wants to harm this gourd vine, they can first ask whether my Wu clan agrees. I said it with absolute force. Both of them instantly changed expressions and looked at me in surprise. Up until now, I had mostly behaved in a mild and easygoing way, so it was easy to forget I was still part of the Wu clan. A moment later, Genuanzi suddenly smiled and said, "Then I take back what I said earlier. It is not that little brother was fortunate to obtain the innate gourd vine. It is that the innate gourd vine was fortunate to meet little brother Wuqian." At that kind of praise from Genuanzi, even I was honestly a little embarrassed by that praise. After all, my real backing was still the 12 Ancestral Witches, those fearless lunatics who dared to fight anything and anyone. If someone wanted to touch my innate gourd vine, then they'd first have to ask whether my brothers and sisters agreed. The innate gourd vine was spirited, and at that moment it seemed to grow excited too. Countless leaves fluttered and swayed like they were dancing. I laughed and said, "Brother Genuanzi, you know more about innate spiritual roots than I do. When you have the time later, help me take a look and see whether there's any way to make this gourd vine grow faster or better." Genuanzi smiled lightly and nodded. Naturally, after that, I passed a few simple methods for controlling the formation to the two of them, left them there to cultivate, and then returned to the Wu clan. The moment I got back to Pangu Hall, I hadn't even sat down beside the Ancestral Witches yet when Dijiang grinned and said, "Wutian, you really had it all planned. I was wondering before why you suddenly stepped in for brothers Genuanzi and Hongjun. So this was what you were aiming for all along. Great, another one misunderstood me." I immediately smiled bitterly. "Brother, I really wasn't doing it for that." But before I could finish, Dijiang waved me off and said with a chuckle, "It's fine. I know everything you do is for the good of our Wu clan. And besides, those two brothers really do have good character. We genuinely do want to befriend them." Right then, Shurong jumped in too, laughing loudly. "I forgot to tell them earlier. Later on, when they're in the primordial world, they don't need to be so careful and timid anymore. With our Wu clan backing them, what do they have to fear?" At once, all the Ancestral Witches burst into laughter again. It was clear that the image of Genuanzi and Hongyun as soft, overly gentle types had already sunk deep into the Ancestral Witches' minds. That probably wasn't going to change anytime soon. I could only mutter inwardly that they had no idea how terrifying an honest person could be once they truly snapped. At that moment, Dijiang smacked Zhurong once, ending the noisy joking. Then his expression turned serious, and he said to me, "Wuqian, after borrowing ideas from the Earthbook formation, the problems in modifying the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation have mostly been solved. Tell me, when should we alter it? Before we formally announce the Wu clan to Father God, or..." As he asked, a thick blood-colored light flashed before me, transmitting the newest version of the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation into my mind. I examined it briefly, understood the changes that had been made, and then said softly, "Let's wait until the day we formally proclaim the clan before Father God. At that time, we may be able to awaken Father God's remaining will within Mount Buzhou. It would be perfect if that can help us complete the formation." The Ancestral Witches all nodded in agreement. Then I hesitated slightly before bringing up something else. "Brothers and sisters, there's another matter I want to discuss with you." Everyone immediately looked over curiously. Dijiang said, "Then say it. When have you ever needed to hold back in front of us? Whatever idea you have, just speak. Would we not trust you?" The other Ancestral Witches nodded and echoed him. Seeing that, I smiled and said, We are the blood of Father God Pangu. We are innate sacred beings of this world, and we were born with control over laws. By rights, we should shoulder a portion of responsibility for this world. The moment I said that, the ancestral witches exchanged looks. Dijiang frowned slightly and asked, "You mean becoming gods? Acting on behalf of the primordial world and governing the operation of laws?" I nodded directly. This coming great era should be the flourishing period of our Wu clan. Because the Wu clan cultivates with baleful aura, we naturally continue clearing the baleful aura from the primordial world and purifying heaven and earth. But what happens when the baleful aura becomes thin? At that point, will the primordial world still need us? Naturally, we have to give ourselves more meaning, make it so that the primordial world cannot do without us. And there was another reason too. Back during Hongjun's second sermon, I had already realized that the ancestral witches were being schemed against by the heavenly Tao precisely because they controlled such powerful laws. The heavenly Tao wanted to take those laws back and make itself more complete. But if the ancestral witches actively became gods of those laws instead, helping govern them, helping operate them, making the primordial world more complete, then things would become very different. And beneath all of that was my deepest reason. Other than Xuanming, Houtu, and me, the remaining 10 ancestral witches had still not cultivated primordial spirits. Their souls were locked inside their bodies. If their fleshly bodies were destroyed, then they would simply dissolve into heaven and earth. I wanted to use this method to leave more marks of their existence within the world itself. That way, even if the worst possible ending still came, I might still have a chance to bring them back. Naturally, I could not say any of those reasons out loud, so when I finished speaking, the ancestral witches reacted differently. Zhurong was the first to shout, "How is that possible? We are Father God's own blood. This entire world was opened by Father God. How could it ever reject us?" But before he could keep going, Zhujuyan suddenly shouted with a dark expression, "Enough!" Zhujuyan rarely spoke much. Even though he and Dijiang usually stood together at the front, it was normally Dijiang who voiced the clan's decisions. But after hearing my words, Zhujuyan's heart had clearly been shaken. This sense of crisis I carried, it wasn't the first time he had noticed it. Could it be that the Wu clan truly did have such a future waiting for it? That thought kept turning in Zhujuyan's heart. It only strengthened his desire to one day use his own law of time to probe the river of time itself and see the Wu clan's future. Unfortunately, at this crucial moment, he still had not broken through into Hunyuan Golden Immortal, so he could only bury the matter in his heart for now. But inwardly, he had already made up his mind. First, they would formally announce the clan to Father God. Afterward, once he reached Hunyuan Golden Immortal, he would definitely join hands with Dijiang and thoroughly investigate the future to settle the doubt in his heart. The ancestral witches had all gone quiet by then, looking curiously toward Zhujuyan, not understanding why he had suddenly become so angry. Zhurong in particular looked both wronged and a little scared. After a while, Zhujuyan calmed down. He swept his gaze across the other ancestral witches, then exchanged a look with Dijiang. Something passed between the two of them in that glance. Only then did Dijiang cough lightly and say in a solemn voice, "Fine. Wuqian, don't worry. We trust you. We'll do it just as you said." Then he turned toward the others and barked, "What are you all waiting for? Get moving and start preparing." Now that both the eldest and second eldest had spoken, what else was there to say? The other ancestral witches all answered with smiles. Even Zhurong, though still muttering under his breath, could only grumble, "I never said I wouldn't listen." Once the decision was made, the ancestral witches moved with incredible speed. They knew that Xuanming, Houtu, and I still had to go to the Purple Dawn Palace for the third sermon, so there was no room to delay our schedule. On top of that, this was a major event for the entire Wu clan. Naturally, they gave it everything they had. As for me, I didn't cultivate during this period at all. Together with Houtu, I returned to the Houtu tribe to help handle its affairs, while also constantly discussing finer details with Dijiang and Zhujuyan. Time passed quickly, and then the day finally came. We did not invite many outsiders. Only Zhen Yuanzi, Hongjun, and Kunpeng, who had already said in the Purple Dawn Palace that he would attend, arrived early beneath Mount Buzhou to witness the event. The 12 Ancestral Witches stood before Pangu Hall facing Mount Buzhou. Behind them were countless sons and daughters of the Wu clan. Suddenly, baleful aura burst from the 12 Ancestral Witches and shot into the heavens, forming 12 towering pillars of fiendish ki that reached heaven and earth. Boom! The 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation appeared. And I stood at the very center of the formation, holding the primordial measuring heaven ruler in my hand. My own aura instantly climbed higher and higher. Then, all at once, the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation, the primordial measuring heaven ruler, Pangu Hall, and Mount Buzhou all began resonating with one another. A vast and heavy Pangu aura awakened from Mount Buzhou itself. The entire primordial world shook violently. What is the Wu clan doing now? Countless great powers were startled awake and immediately cast their eyes in this direction, all of them inwardly shocked. Then Dijiang's voice rang through heaven and earth. Great Tao above, Father God Pangu above, heaven and earth of the primordial world bear witness, heavenly Tao bear witness. Today, we who are born from Father God Pangu's blood establish ourselves according to Father God's will. The instant those words rang out, the beings of the primordial world became even more shocked. The Wu clan. What exactly were they trying to do now? Great Tao above? Great Tao? Who did they think they were talking to? Many great powers even felt a trace of disdain in their hearts. And when they looked closer, they saw that in this public proclamation to heaven and earth, the Wu clan had not even mentioned Hongjun Daozu at all. Even the heavenly Tao had only been invited as a witness. Quite a few people frowned. Yes, everyone knew the Wu clan only respected Father God Pangu, but this was too much. They were practically not placing Hongjun Daozu or the heavenly Tao in their eyes at all. For a time, countless cultivators left their dojos and rose into the sky, looking from afar toward the foot of Mount Buzhou, where the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation now towered. Even Hongjun Daozu himself appeared, seated high in the 9 heavens, his gaze indifferent as he looked toward Mount Buzhou. Behind him surged endless heavenly Tao power. Meanwhile, Dijing's voice continued. Today, seeing that the heavenly Tao is not yet complete, we are willing to operate laws and help perfect the primordial world. We take it upon ourselves to guard Mount Buzhou and help govern the land of the primordial world. Therefore, today, we establish the Wu clan. Let the primordial earth be our foundation, Mount Buzhou our ancestral land, and let Pangu Hall and the primordial measuring heaven ruler suppress and stabilize our destiny. The Wu clan stand. The moment those words fell, the entire primordial world trembled. Boundless primal energy surged. Endless baleful aura swept toward the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation. The pressure radiating from Mount Buzhou became stronger and stronger, even beginning to condense into gray mist hanging in the sky. At the same time, a formless river of destiny slowly appeared in the void. The destinies of the ancestral witches and all ordinary Wu clansmen rose upward like smoke signals and began pouring into that river, causing it to grow at a terrifying speed. But because it was expanding too quickly, the river of destiny began to shake violently, showing faint signs of instability. Then in the next instant, Pangu Hall directly rose into the air and crashed down into the river of destiny. Boom. The whole thing stabilized at once. And not only that, even the primordial measuring heaven ruler in my hand flew out in a streak of golden light and settled atop Pangu Hall, continuously releasing dark yellow golden radiance. The moment it appeared, much of the baleful aura inside the Destiny River was directly suppressed and neutralized. At that same instant, a thought suddenly flashed through my mind. Without hesitation, I transmitted my voice urgently to the Ancestral Witches. Full power! Operate the formation! Connect with Mount Buzhou and summon the Pangu True Body! The moment they heard me, Dijiang and the others did not hesitate in the slightest. They acted at once. At the same time, I also activated my own Pangu True Body divine power. Boom! The 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation trembled. Endless baleful aura from heaven and earth collapsed toward the formation. Combined with the power of 12 laws and strengthened by the formation itself, it condensed into a gray figure. The Pangu True Body! Cries of shock erupted across the entire primordial world. As they looked at the vast gray figure and felt that unbelievably dense aura of Pangu, everyone was so shaken that they could not help shouting in alarm. Only now did they finally understand why the Wu clan had been so overbearing, why they did not even place Hongjun in their eyes. So this was why they could summon the Pangu True Body. The moment the Pangu True Body appeared, even Hongjun Daozu, whose expression had remained indifferent the whole time, could not help knitting his brows slightly. Then the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation continued expanding. The outer edges of the formation spread toward Mount Buzhou, and the Pangu aura awakened within the mountain was instantly drawn out. It poured into the gray figure like an enormous tornado. Dijiang suddenly cried out. Summoning the Pangu True Body had never been an easy thing for the Ancestral Witches, even under normal circumstances. Just that brief moment had already placed enormous pressure on all of them. But the instant they resonated with Mount Buzhou, they suddenly felt the pressure drop sharply. Everything became much easier. Inwardly, Dijiang quickly estimated that where before they could only sustain the Pangu True Body with their full strength for about 1 incense stick of time, now the duration had more than doubled, and with far less backlash. It had to be because of Mount Buzhou. Dijiang's heart was filled with delight. He immediately turned toward the center of the formation, toward where I should have been, wanting to call out, Wuqian, your method really works. But when he looked, I was gone. Dijiang's heart immediately jolted. Before he could shout, though, my voice rang in his ear. Brother, I'm here. Dijiang followed the sound and looked carefully. Only then did he realize that at some unknown point, I had already fallen into the phantom of the Pangu true body itself. My eyes were tightly shut, and I looked as though I had lost consciousness. In truth, I had not lost consciousness at all, but I had no ability to control my body now. The Pangu true body, summoned by the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation, had resonated directly with my own Pangu true body divine power and pulled me inside it, almost as if the Pangu true body they summoned had directly fused its blessing onto me. On top of that, the Pangu aura from Mount Bujo was still pouring into it. That power was simply too much. I could not control it at all. And yet in that moment I felt something indescribably strange and profound. The aura of the Pangu true body continuously poured into my body. The law marks in my soul were being engraved at incredible speed. A vast, majestic will was with me, and I knew with complete clarity what it was. It was the remnant will of Father God Pangu. The ancestral witches had called it forth from Mount Buzo and from heaven and earth itself. Then the giant phantom raised one arm and lightly pointed toward the newly formed river of Wu clan destiny. At the tip of that finger, a single profound rune flew out. It carried an incomparably heavy Pangu aura as it fell into the river of destiny. Wu. The rune reflected itself into the hearts of every Wu clansman. In that instant, every member of the Wu clan understood clearly. This was Father God Pangu's blessing. The moment the rune entered the Destiny River, the Wu clan's destiny surged once more and swelled even further. Before the ancestral witches could even cry out in gratitude, another beam of white light suddenly shot out from the depths of Mount Bujo. It looked like pure jade marrow. It flew directly into Pangu Hall and plunged into the blood pool within. The blood pool that nurtured the Wu clan instantly swelled. A thought flashed through my mind. Pangu jade marrow. Mount Bujo had been formed from Pangu's spine. Within it, naturally, there had once been the marrow of Father God Pangu, the very source from which Pangu blood essence had been created. Even if it could no longer generate true Pangu essence blood now, once it fell into the blood pool, it was still enough to bring tremendous future foundation to the Wu clan. This was Pangu's second gift. Even as everyone was wondering whether there would be a third, the Pangu true body towering between heaven and earth suddenly began collapsing and falling back into the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation. In an instant, it dispersed. From afar, all the watching powers of the primordial world let out quiet breaths of relief. At least that terrifying thing was gone. My own figure appeared once more at the center of the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation. But right then, I only felt as though both my soul and fleshly body were on the verge of exploding. Blood Ki roared through me wildly. The 9 revolutions. Mysterious art spun at insane speed, yet still could not erase that sensation. Because in that brief moment earlier, the Pangu true body, summoned by the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation and then strengthened through resonance with Mount Bujo, had not actually dispersed completely at all. It had rushed directly into my body. This was Pangu's third gift. Then, in the next moment above the void, heavenly Tao power was still surging while Hongjun Daozu sat even higher above. Suddenly, however, another space directly formed beyond even that. Clear drifting primal Ki appeared. In that instant, Hongjun felt an overwhelming pressure descend. The heavenly Tao laws around him froze on the spot, as though frozen solid. The great Tao had descended in favor. How was that possible? Just because the Wu clan called out to it a few times, the great Tao had truly appeared? It wasn't only Hongjun Daozu. All the great powers of the primordial world directly stood up, their eyes filled with utter disbelief. Even after the clear key of the great Tao gently fell, they still wore expressions that looked like they could not believe what they were seeing. Why? Because Pangu was the child of the great Tao. Because the ancestral witches were born of Pangu's blood. Because the Wu clan respected only Pangu. And because, through the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation, the ancestral witches had summoned Pangu's remaining will from the primordial world itself. Naturally, the great Tao had to show some face. So at this moment it appeared and sent down great Tao merit. My attempt to brush against the great Tao had actually succeeded. I was so excited that I could hardly contain it. Standing inside the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation, I raised my head and looked at the great Tao merit slowly descending. The fiendish barrier above the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation was incomparably heavy, but it posed not the slightest obstruction to the great Tao merit. It was as though they did not even exist on the same level. The merit descended, then split apart in midair into separate portions. One by one, they fell toward the heads of the ancestral witches. Pangu Hall and the primordial measuring heaven ruler, both of which had been used to suppress the Wu clan's destiny during the establishment of the clan, also received a share. I had no time to think about anything else. I immediately focused all my attention on the Great Tao merit. As the merit descended, I suddenly felt as though my primordial spirit were melting. It began fusing toward my body once again. At the same time, my soul began shining, and the indestructible spiritual light within it grew brighter and brighter. On my soul, the phantom form that carried the law powers of the 12 Ancestral Witches and had fused into a shadow of the Pangu true body was still there. Around it circled the marks of innate yin, yang, and the 5 elements. What came next was the Dutian divine thunder. It seemed to be a thunder method born with the Pangu true body itself. The moment that thunder resounded, my entire body shook violently. My perception changed in an instant. My awareness seemed to split into countless fragments. Under that single peal of thunder, it felt as though the flesh and blood throughout my body had all been split apart, as though every tiny particle of me had become its own little patch of chaotic space. And then, in the next instant, the gray imprint was reflected directly into all of it. Every strand of flesh, every drop of blood, was deeply branded with that gray mark. It took the shape of my own soul, seated within each tiny fragment like a divine figure. Boundless divine light burst out from my body. Blood rebirth. Almost without thinking, I instantly understood the change that had happened to me. Every strand of my flesh now carried spirit. In the future, even if I suffered devastating damage, as long as a single thread of flesh or one drop of essence blood remained, I would still have a chance to rebuild myself. Perfect. I was instantly overjoyed. For a cautious person like me, this was practically a custom-made life-saving ability. When the Great Tao made a move, it really did so with terrifying generosity. I immediately decided in my heart that once this clan-establishing ceremony was over, I would stash a few drops of my essence blood away in Pangu Hall in Mount Buzhou and inside the primordial measuring heaven ruler. In the next moment, those countless split-off thoughts snapped back together, and my primordial spirit appeared once more. But now, it had already reached balance with my body. Both had advanced all the way to the peak of Great Luo Golden Immortal. I could even feel the faint urge to break through. At that moment, the primordial measuring heaven ruler also descended from the sky and returned to my hand inside the 12 heavenly gods fiend formation. My face lit up with delight yet again. After so much refining, I had already refined 36 of the 49 innate restrictions within the treasure. But what both surprised and delighted me was that deep within the layers of innate restrictions, in the very place where the great Tao merit had settled, countless runes were now twisting and growing, and brand new restrictions were being born. After receiving great Tao merit, was the primordial measuring heaven ruler about to advance too? At present, the primordial measuring heaven ruler was already an innate merit supreme treasure, one inclined toward offense and killing, capable of slaying without staining one's karma. If it rose again, then what level would it reach? And unlike Pangu Hall, which belonged to all the ancestral witches together, the primordial measuring heaven ruler was mine alone. The changes inside its innate restrictions were still continuing. But even before that process finished, one effect had already become obvious. Under the blessing of great Tao merit, the primordial measuring heaven ruler's ability to suppress destiny had taken a huge leap. The 12 ancestral witches had been born from Pangu's essence blood. When they united and activated the Pangu imprint in their bloodline, they could draw on the lingering power of Pangu in heaven and earth and condense a phantom of Pangu himself. In theory, that phantom required all 12 ancestral witches to fuse their bloodline power together and activate the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation to fully manifest. Even if its raw strength did not necessarily surpass a heavenly Tao saint, the boundless savage aura and world-opening pressure it radiated made opponents feel small and suppressed from the root of their existence. But now, because I had refined the origin laws of all 12 ancestral witches, and because of the 9 revolutions' mysterious art, I no longer needed the 12 ancestral witches in order to activate the Pangu true body on my own. My heart practically exploded with joy. With a trump card like that, surviving in the primordial world became vastly more secure. And on top of that, my body had undergone a second strengthening. I could clearly feel a vast force surging inside me. That was Pangu's power. The Pangu true body could briefly grant me a tiny portion of Pangu's strength. It was only a tiny amount, yes. But together with my inherited memories and the 9 revolutions' mysterious art, the cultivation method once walked by Pangu himself, and with the support of the 12 ancestral laws, I had now truly stepped onto Pangu's road. The path of proving the Tao through strength. It was an unbelievably difficult road, but for the first time I could clearly see hope on the path ahead. And I could also see more clearly that changing the original great trend was possible. After all, my ties to the ancestral witches had long since become inseparable. This also gave me much more confidence for the future, especially when facing Hongjun. Back in the Purple Dawn Palace, being able to block Hongjun Daozu's probing gaze had already owed a great deal to the primordial measuring heaven ruler. After this growth, the concealment around my heavenly secrets became even deeper. From now on, Even if Hongjun forcibly tried to pry into me, he might not be able to see much at all. This time, when the ancestral witches proclaimed the Wu clan before heaven and earth, it would not be an exaggeration to say that I had played the biggest role in making it happen. Without me, then, in the original course of events, the ancestral witches would only have established the Wu clan after Dijun founded the demon clan, doing so merely in direct opposition. And yet through this entire ceremony, I had barely spoken at all. The benefits I gained were even greater than what most of the ancestral witches received, but because I had hidden inside the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation, I was almost like someone who did not exist. Other than those who already knew, everyone in the primordial world had their attention fixed entirely on Dijung and the other 12 ancestral witches. Their gazes burned as they watched them. And with the primordial measuring heaven ruler back in my hand, my heavenly secrets became even harder to detect. After only briefly checking the changes to myself and the treasure, I had no time to keep dwelling on it. I quickly turned my attention toward the ancestral witches. At this point, equally profound changes had begun appearing on them. Dijing and the others had never truly been without souls. It was just that they could not cultivate primordial spirits. Their bodies were too powerful. Their souls were locked inside their flesh and blood so tightly that they could not break free. If the soul could not leave the body, then how could a primordial spirit ever be formed? But as the great Tao merit descended, the originally unshakable strength of their flesh was actually broken open. Traces of soul force were drawn out from within their blood and flesh. At the same time, strand after strand of baleful aura was stripped away and rose upward, dispersing into heaven and earth together with their own law power. Seeing that, some people could not help crying out in alarm. The ancestral witches, are they all about to cultivate primordial spirits? Even I felt that hope rise in my heart. But the great Tao did not choose to break the fundamental rule of the ancestral witches' existence. Instead, in response to the oath they had made earlier, it drew out a thread of each ancestral witch's soul power, carrying their own law imprints, and let it merge into heaven and earth. Hongjun Daozu's expression suddenly changed. He had already sensed the heavenly Tao surging wildly. Countless law energies and primal forces were pouring toward the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation. Then, in the very next moment, 12 towering phantoms appeared, centered on the imprints of the ancestral witches. Filled by heavenly Tao power, their forms became more and more solid. They were the forms of the ancestral witches themselves. But their aura was completely different from normal. When the ancestral witches revealed their true bodies, the baleful aura they carried was usually overwhelming and savage beyond compare. But these phantoms were different. They radiated heavy law power tinged with clear, pure spiritual intent. Before anyone could finish processing that, the phantom of Dijiang at the front suddenly opened his eyes. His pupils were pure silver white. There was no emotion in them at all, only cold, absolute reason. Then he said, I am Dijiang, god of space. I govern the law of space, and shall operate that law to maintain the primordial world. The moment those words fell, his figure began slowly dissolving and merging into heaven and earth. Far above, Hongjun Daozu, seated upon the heavenly Tao, suddenly felt his heart jolt. The power of the heavenly Tao had sharply increased, becoming more complete than before. And yet that increase was entirely beyond his control. Hongjun's brows instantly drew together. Then Zhu Juyin spoke next. I am Zhu Juyin, god of time. I govern the law of time, and shall operate that law to maintain the primordial world. After him, the remaining figures all spoke one after another, each declaring their own divine office before merging into heaven and earth. The entire primordial world instantly felt a little more stable. Aside from Dijiang and Zhu Juyin, the other ancestral witches also took their own positions. Gumang, Zhurong, Rushu, and Xuanming, in addition to their own laws, became the gods of the four directions. Houtu sat at the center. Because of Gumang's flourishing wood, Zhurong's blazing fire, Rushu's harsh metal, and Xuanming's freezing severity, those four also took on the positions of the gods of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Gonggong became the water god. Qiangliang and Shizi became the gods of thunder and lightning. Tianwu became the god of wind. Shibishi became the god of weather. As the ancestral witches took their places as gods of law, the strength of the heavenly Tao surged by an absurd amount. No one felt that more clearly than Hongjun Daozu himself. But the great powers watching from afar wore extremely solemn expressions. Recalling Hongjun Daozu's earlier explanation that saints wielded the laws of the heavenly Tao, a single thought began rising in many of their hearts. The ancestral witches are trying to seize the authority of the heavenly Tao. No wonder they never put Hongjun Daozu in their eyes. But in truth, they were completely wrong. The ancestral witches had never thought of it that way at all. In their minds, this entire primordial world had been opened by Father God Pangu. That meant it already belonged to the Wu clan in the first place. What was there to seize? And besides, the ancestral witches hated trouble. Earlier, some of them had even worried that if this really meant they had to constantly pay attention to the laws of the primordial world and spend all their time managing them, wouldn't that be unbearably troublesome and boring? But fortunately, that was not how it worked. The law gods the ancestral witches became were completely different from the later incense gods who relied on worship and faith. They did not need to respond to the desires of sentient beings. They did not need incense, offerings, or wishes. They were simply a part of heaven and earth itself. They only needed to let the laws run according to their own natural principles, and the ancestral witches themselves had no need to interfere with those laws using personal feelings either. Take the cycle of the 4 seasons as an example. If they personally interfered, that would only generate karmic burden and heavenly retribution. Returning the rules to heaven and earth itself was precisely what let the ancestral witches relax. Once they understood that, every last bit of their earlier hesitation vanished, and they directly accepted my suggestion. But Hongjun Daozu was different. If he wanted to merge with the Dao, then the more authority over heavenly Dao laws he could control, the deeper his level of union with the Dao would become, and the higher he could continue climbing. As all this unfolded, vast and heavy destiny rose out of nowhere and poured into the Wu clan's river of destiny. That destiny river swelled wildly, and yet it no longer shook in the slightest. Above it floated the shadows of Pangu Hall and the primordial measuring heaven ruler, while around it appeared the phantoms of the 12 ancestral witches in their divine aspect, suppressing the river of destiny firmly in place. Only then did the aura of the great Tao quietly fade away, as though it had never appeared at all. But everyone knew very well that what had just happened was no illusion. That vast and immeasurable pressure still lingered in their hearts. Hongjun Daozu also quietly let out a breath and looked toward the place where the great Tao had vanished. Envy showed itself in his eyes, and in his heart he could only sigh. The great Tao really does favor Pangu and his descendants. Even Pangu's bloodline can receive the blessing of the great Tao. At that moment, the power of the heavenly Tao became active as well, surging toward the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation near Mount Buzhou. The ancestral witches might not have shown it much face this time, treating the heavenly Tao as little more than an observer. But what they had done had undeniably made heaven and earth more complete. And on top of that, the great Tao itself had already bestowed merit. If the heavenly Tao gave no response at all now, wouldn't that be practically slapping the great Tao in the face? So in the next instant, another phenomenon appeared. High in the 9 heavens, within heavy clouds of auspicious light, countless strands of golden merit gathered. As the first saint, Hongjun Daozu could not stop the heavenly Tao from descending merit, though he could interfere with the process. But after only the slightest turn of thought, he gave an almost invisible shake of the head. Out of sight, out of mind. He simply disappeared and returned to the Purple Dawn Palace. Boom. A huge pillar of heavenly merit descended toward the Wu clan. The ancestral witches and I each received the largest shares. Pangu Hall and the primordial measuring heaven ruler also received quite a lot. The ordinary Wu clansmen each received scattered points of golden light. And not only that, even Zhen Yuanzi, Hongyun, and Kun Peng, whom I had invited to witness the ceremony, each got a share too. Hongyun sighed a little. Too bad it isn't great Dao merit. Zhen Yuanzi immediately smacked him lightly and laughed as he scolded, "You should be grateful to get heavenly Dao merit at all. And you're still dreaming of great Dao merit? You really dare imagine things. We should be thanking little brother Wuqian for inviting us at all. We only got to share in this fortune because of him." Hongyun quickly laughed and said, "I was only sighing, that's all." At the same time, he couldn't help looking toward Kunpeng at the side. Ever since learning that Kunpeng had handed over the Northern Black Abyss water-controlling banner to me, Hongyun's impression of him had changed drastically. He really had not expected Kunpeng to be willing to part with something like that. Then thinking again about the massive karma he still owed me and still had no idea how to repay. And now on top of that, having received another share of heavenly Dao merit because of me, Hongyun could only smile bitterly. A little while later, the enormous descent of heavenly Dao merit finally ended. The strange phenomena filling heaven and earth gradually faded. Seeing that, the ancestral witches also directly withdrew the 12 heavenly gods' fiend formation. As the world-piercing baleful aura dispersed, the Wu clan's river of destiny also disappeared from sight. Heaven and earth returned to calm, but the Wu clan itself became lively beyond compare. At this point, I was still collecting my own share of heavenly Dao merit and thinking about how best to use it when Dijiang suddenly flashed to my side. His face was full of excitement. He gave me a heavy slap on the shoulder and burst into booming laughter. "Wuqian, you really did it. We really received Father God's blessing. Even the great Dao showed up. Ha ha ha. From now on, whatever you say, your big brother will listen." The other ancestral witches all arrived too, every one of them excited beyond measure, crowding around me and shouting all at once. For a moment, it felt like countless thunderclaps were going off right next to my ears. My scalp went numb. Only after the ancestral witches had shouted themselves out a bit did Dijiang finally speak again. "There's another piece of good news. This time, the Wu clan's destiny has surged enormously. Under this increase in destiny, I've already sensed the opportunity to break through into Hongyuan Golden Immortal. It probably won't take long before I do. That came as a real surprise to him too. He had thought that splitting off part of his soul and law imprint would have some negative effect, but instead it had not harmed him in the slightest. If anything, it had strengthened his control over the law of space. Jujuyin smiled faintly and nodded. Me too. I was instantly delighted. That was absolutely huge news. The stronger the ancestral witches became, the more secure my own position became. So I quickly looked toward the others, especially the loudest one among them all, Ancestral Witch Zhurong, only to find him scratching his head awkwardly before mumbling, "I'm still just a little short. Just a tiny bit." Everyone burst into laughter. What I did not notice, however, was the look that Dijiang and Jujuyin exchanged. It was obvious the two of them had silently made up their minds about something. Afterward, everyone returned to the tribe. Today was the formal establishment of the clan, so naturally there had to be a great celebration. The Wu clansmen had already prepared roaring fires, and endless ferocious beast meat and blood food had all been set out. I personally welcomed Zhenyuanzi and Hongjun in. Kunpeng, meanwhile, was still the same as ever. He only smiled and offered me a short congratulations, then politely declined the invitation to stay for the feast and quietly left. At another place, Fuxi and Nuwa were also present. At that time, the Dijun and Taiyi brothers were with them as well. After a grand speech about future ambition and destiny, Dijun had already moved Fuxi and Nuwa, and the four of them had started preparing to join forces to establish the demon clan and create the demonic Dao. They had been discussing the finer details when they were suddenly interrupted by the massive commotion of the Wu clan's clan founding ceremony. All four of them flew out of their dojo together and watched from the sky. When they saw all the benefits the Wu clan obtained from establishing the clan, especially that vast sea of merit, Dijun felt something strange rise in his heart. It felt as though someone had gotten ahead of him. After all the phenomena came to an end, the four returned silently to their dojo, each carrying their own heavy thoughts. The moment they sat down again, Dijun immediately said in a solemn voice, "This won't do. We have to hurry too." Then after a pause, he added, "If we proclaim ourselves before the great Tao, just like the Wu clan did, do you think we might also receive the great Tao's favor and be granted great Tao merit?" At those words, the corner of Fuxi's mouth twitched slightly, but he endured it and said nothing. He only turned and glanced toward his younger sister Nuwa. Dijun was momentarily speechless. Then he let out a sigh and said irritably, "Do you think you're ancestral witches? Can you summon the Pangu true body?" Fuxi and Dijun were both beings of great wisdom, so naturally they could both see at a glance why the great Tao merit had appeared. In the entire primordial world, other than the Wu clan, perhaps only the three pure ones might still be able to summon the residual will of Pangu. After all, they were formed from the three parts of Pangu's primordial spirit, and each of them carried 1/3 of the imprint of the opening of heaven. As for trying to imitate the Wu clan and proclaim themselves before the great Tao, that was pure fantasy. In the original Great Trend, even the three pure ones didn't choose that route when they became saints, Dijun said flatly. So stop daydreaming. Hurry and go gather the surviving remnants of the Dragon, Phoenix, and Killen clans, as well as many other races as possible. Bring them all into our demon clan. Next comes the third sermon, when Tao Ancestor will explain the method of proving the Tao, becoming a saint, and attaining Hunyuan. If we can use the destiny of establishing the clan to step into the quasi-saint realm first, then perhaps we'll gain even more from that final sermon. Dijun's voice was extremely serious. Taiyi immediately stood up and nodded. "Don't worry, big brother. Our demon clan is the opportunity of all races in the primordial world. We'll shelter them and open the demon Tao for them. They should be thanking us, not refusing to join." As he said that, he lightly tapped the chaos bell with one finger. Instantly, an oppressive aura spread out through the chaos itself, making even Fuxi and Nua's expressions change slightly. Only then did Taiyi smile and add, "And if any of them don't know what's good for them, then they can first ask whether my chaos bell agrees." Fuxi couldn't help frowning. The matter of the demon clan had indeed been initiated by Dijun and Taiyi. They were the ones who had come to draw him and Nuwa into it, so the real initiative naturally lay in the hands of the Dijun brothers. Even so, Fuxi still couldn't hold back from speaking. "Fellow Taoist Taiyi, if we gather the myriad races beneath the name of demon, shelter them, and guide them, then that is naturally a meritorious thing. But I hope fellow Taoist will be cautious in using force. If some are truly unwilling, then let them go. If we suppress them by force, we'll inevitably create karmic entanglements." Taiyi clearly disagreed. But before he could rebut him, Dijun directly smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist Fuxi speaks well. Taiyi, what we want are like-minded allies, not slaves subdued by your strength." What more could Taiyi say after that? He could only cup his hands toward the three of them. Understood. Then he turned and left the dojo. Dijun, however, remained behind. Together with Fuxi and Nua, he began discussing the details. The task before the three of them now was to create a cultivation method suitable for the demon clan, something that could become the demon clan's foundational art. At the same time, over on Kunlun Mountain, the three pure ones also descended from the clouds and returned to their dojo after the phenomena in heaven and earth came to an end. All three of them were full of complicated thoughts. As fellow descendants of Pangu, the three pure ones had always looked at the ancestral witches with a certain disdain. In their eyes, the ancestral witches acted recklessly, violently, and without restraint, almost as if they had no sense of heavenly numbers and no brains at all. But what had happened today had shaken them. First came Father God Pangu's blessing, then the favor of the great Tao. And finally, even the heavenly Tao had descended an enormous amount of merit. The three pure ones were strong-minded, yes, but even they could not help feeling envy in the face of all that. For a long time, none of them could calm down. Yuanshi Tianzun was the first to speak. Big brother, do you think we have any chance of obtaining a portion of great Tao merit too? Taiking was stunned for a moment when he heard that, but then he slowly shook his head. Stop thinking about it. The great Tao only appeared because of Pangu. How exactly do you think we're supposed to summon Pangu? As he said that, his eyes drifted meaningfully toward Yuanshi and Tongtian. The implication was obvious enough. The three of them were each 1/3 of Pangu's primordial spirit. So what, were they supposed to recombine into one whole just for the sake of chasing great Tao merit? After that, Taiking said flatly, don't think too much. Now that the heavenly Tao has appeared, and Hongjun Daozu has already become a saint, the heavenly Tao will only grow more and more complete. In this primordial world, in the end, it is still the affairs of the heavenly Tao that matter most. We should cultivate properly and wait for the third sermon. Afterward, proving the Tao and becoming saints, that is the proper road. Yuanshi nodded slightly. Tongtian also gave a distracted little sound of agreement, but in truth his attention had already shifted elsewhere. Inwardly he was muttering to himself, where was that Wutian fellow? For something as important as the founding of the Wu clan, that guy hadn't appeared openly at all. Ever since the earlier events in the Purple Dawn Palace, Tongtian had already become deeply curious about me. It was obvious that I held a high position among the Wu clan, and even the ancestral witches seemed to listen to me more than they let on. Yet my aura remained tightly restrained. Nothing like the dense, baleful presence carried by the ancestral witches themselves. A person that special, and yet he had not shown himself during such an important moment? Naturally, Tongtian found that strange. Still, he was clever enough to keep it to himself. He knew Yuanshi was still extremely unhappy about both me and the ancestral witches because of what had happened before, so Tongtian only thought about it inwardly and did not bring it up. After that, the three pure ones also entered cultivation. Compared to almost everyone else, their conditions were vastly better. They didn't need to struggle around searching for their path. Their own Tao already existed within them. All they needed to do was cultivate properly, raise their strength as quickly as possible, and prepare to seize the chance presented by the third sermon in the Purple Dawn Palace. Over on Penglai Island, Dong Wanggong stared blankly for a long time after the phenomena in heaven and earth faded. Only then did he turn to the many living beings below and say, let us continue. While the entire primordial world had been shaken by the establishment of the Wu clan, Dong Wanggong had been imitating Hongjun Daozu and preaching the immortal Tao to a gathering of living beings. Originally, he had hoped to do this together with Shiwangmu, but Shiwangmu had absolutely refused, so Dong Wanggong had no choice but to do it alone. He proclaimed to the cultivators around Penglai Island and the Eastern Sea that anyone with affinity for the immortal Tao could come to Penglai and hear the teachings. At that time, cultivation methods in the primordial world were still badly lacking. It wasn't as if every being had bloodline inheritance or its own built-in path. Naturally, countless beings had come in reverence. But halfway through the sermon, he had been interrupted by the huge events surrounding the Wu clan. Now, after resuming, Dong Wanggong forcibly suppressed the unrest in his heart and continued explaining the immortal Tao methods he had summarized. Many wondrous phenomena appeared over Penglai Island too, but when he got as far as the profound immortal realm, Dong Wanggong finally could not help stopping again. This sermon will end here for now. After the third Purple Dawn Palace sermon is over, I will continue and explain the cultivation above Golden Immortal for all of you. The assembled crowd was reluctant, but no one dared complain. They hurriedly kowtowed and thanked Dong Wanggong for his transmission and guidance. In truth, Dong Wanggong had become the first person after Hongjun to openly preach the Tao across the lands of the primordial world. On top of that, Hongjun Daozu clearly intended to support him. So at once, heavenly Tao power stirred, and a large share of heavenly Tao merit descended in dark yellow light. Dong Wanggong received the merit, but as soon as he did, he suddenly remembered the great Tao's favor that had descended upon the Wu clan. along with the vast tide of heavenly Tao merit that followed afterward. The moment that comparison rose in his mind, the merit in his own hands no longer looked nearly so impressive. Dong Wanggong's eyes darkened slightly as a thought surfaced. Maybe he should imitate them a little, not by founding a race, of course, but perhaps by creating a major force of his own, gathering together the many cultivators of the immortal Tao on Penglai Island into a single faction. The moment that thought appeared, it felt like a sudden flash of understanding in his heart. Dong Wanggong softly murmured one name, the Immortal Court. Back on my side, I naturally had no idea just how much shock the Wu clan's early establishment had caused throughout the Primordial World. The Primordial World looked calmer and more prosperous on the surface, but deep underneath, the currents were already beginning to move. At that moment, I was thinking about an entirely different problem. As I watched the Wu clansmen happily slaughtering demon beasts and using them as blood food, I couldn't help sinking into thought. I was considering the future road of development for the Wu clan. Right now, the Wu clan treated demon beasts as blood food. And since the demon clan had not yet been founded, no one was saying anything about it. But once Dijun established the demon clan, he would definitely start speaking up for them. Otherwise, the demon clan would never stand firmly on its own footing. And once that happened, conflict between the Wu and demon clans would become nearly unavoidable. So what was I supposed to do? Should I try to make the Wu clan develop some kind of livestock industry and start raising demon beasts? That kind of meticulous work was absolutely not something these big, rough Wu clansmen were suited for. Besides, the primordial world was vast beyond imagination, with endless blood food everywhere. Why would they ever bother doing something so troublesome? No, that wouldn't work. I needed another answer. After all, once you got beyond the level of great witches, and especially ancestral witches, you could already cultivate simply by devouring the baleful aura of heaven and earth. Take Dijiang, for example. Did eating demon beasts even help him now? For an existence of his level, ordinary demon beasts were barely enough to get stuck between his teeth. He got far more benefit from directly devouring the dense, baleful aura filling heaven and earth. But weaker members of the Wu clan absolutely could not live without blood food. And now, because Father God Pangu's remnant had drawn out Pangu Jade Marrow from Mount Bozo and dropped it into Pangu Hall's blood pool during the clan establishing ceremony, the drying up of the blood pool had already been greatly eased. That meant the number of Wu clansmen would definitely grow even more in the future. In other words, the contradiction would only grow worse. As far as I was concerned, the true foundation of the Wu clan lay in the ancestral witches themselves. The standard of prosperity for the Wu clan should be strength, not sheer numbers. Wouldn't it make more sense to go directly down an elite development route? Just as I was turning that over in my mind, a voice suddenly sounded beside me. It was Genuanzi. He smiled and said, "Little brother Wuqian, this time we've once again accepted your favor and gained another share of heavenly Tao merit because of you. This old brother of yours really feels ashamed." My thoughts were interrupted at once. Still, matters concerning the future development of the entire Wu clan were not something I could solve in one moment, nor something I could decide with a single sentence. So I simply pressed those thoughts down for now, turned and smiled at Genuanzi and Hongjun. "Old brother, what are you saying? You spent all this time coming to the Wu clan to witness the ceremony. If anything, I should be the one thanking you." Genuanzi only shook his head with a smile. Outwardly, he let it go at that, but inwardly he was muttering to himself. For an event like this, why had I invited them specifically, and not just anyone else? Obviously because I truly regarded them highly. But he didn't continue dwelling on it. Instead, Genuanzi changed the topic and said with a smile, "Earlier, when Hongyun and I were cultivating beside the innate gourd vine, didn't you ask me whether I had any suggestions? I don't have a method to make the innate gourd vine mature faster, but I do have another idea." I blinked. Then I heard him continue. "That innate gourd vine carries innate yin, yang, and the 5 elements. Even among innate spiritual roots, it would rank among the foremost. It is truly extraordinary. Have you ever thought about letting those innate yin, yang, and 5 elements become one?" My heart jolted. At once, my thoughts sank inward toward my soul. At that moment, the indestructible spiritual light in my soul was already dazzling beyond compare. The earlier shadow of the innate gourd vine that had once been engraved on my soul had now turned into a chaotic blur. "You mean combining the 7 gourds of yin, yang, and the 5 elements into one and producing some kind of chaos gourd?" The thought felt a little weird. 7 gourds combining into one? Why did that sound suspiciously like some kind of gourd superfusion? Was I supposed to turn into the old grandpa from a storybook next? But Genuanzi slowly shook his head. No, these 7 gourds each have their own wonder. If they simply disappeared in order to merge, that would be too much of a pity. But if one could stimulate the vine to bloom again and produce one more fruit, then wouldn't that be the best of both worlds? The moment I heard that, my heart instantly began racing. If what Genuanzi said could really be done, then I would gain an extra chaos gourd from nowhere. Of course I wanted that. But I still hesitated a little. Can that really work? Aren't there only supposed to be 7 gourds? Isn't that a fixed heavenly number? At that point, Hongjun burst out laughing. Ha ha ha. If anyone else said something like that, then maybe it wouldn't work. But have you forgotten who old brother Zhen Yuanzi is? If he says it can be done, then it definitely can. Zhen Yuanzi immediately turned back and glared at Hongjun. Too much talk. Keep shouting like that and you'll spill all my secrets. Then he looked back at me with a smile and said, why not give it a try? Zhen Yuanzi didn't promise it with absolute certainty, but there was a firmness in his tone that made it hard to doubt him. After all, he felt he owed me too much, and unlike Kunpeng, he did not have a treasure like the Northern Black Abyss water-controlling banner to hand over in repayment. Naturally, he wanted to do everything he could. Inwardly, Zhen Yuanzi suddenly understood something. No wonder Kunpeng, poor as he was, had still been willing to hand over an innate spiritual treasure. The feeling of owing someone karma really was awful. Then again, with Zhen Yuanzi's personality, it made sense he would feel that way. He was a genuine good person with a very thin face. If it had been Jian or Junti instead, they definitely wouldn't have had this kind of trouble. At that point, I couldn't remain seated any longer either. I immediately stood up and walked over toward Dijiang and Zhu Juyin, preparing to explain the matter before heading straight to the innate gourd vine. Dijiang heard me out and laughed. Go if you want. Your second brother and I were also just preparing to enter seclusion and cultivate. We were aiming to break into the Hunyuan Golden Immortal Realm. As he said that, he patted me again and laughed loudly. Once our strength goes up even further, then if anyone dares bully you, we'll just march straight to their door and beat them senseless. At that moment, Zhurong suddenly jumped in. Big brother, what about those 2 Western fellows, Jian and Junti? We still haven't settled that account from before. Are we really just going to let it go? Dijiang froze for a moment, then burst out laughing. Of course not. Once I come out of seclusion, we'll go pay the Western world a little visit. Ha 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 ha. At those words, both Zhen Yuanzi and Hongjun sucked in a sharp breath and couldn't help exchanging looks. The ancestral witches were really that vengeful. To be fair, during the events in the Purple Dawn Palace, the ones who had truly lost face and taken a beating were Jieyin and Junti. The Wu clan had not suffered at all. But when Zhen Yuanzi and Hongjun remembered that those 2 from the west had originally been targeting Hongjun in the first place, they couldn't help feeling a wave of satisfaction rise inside them. The smiles on their faces became noticeably brighter. Sometimes it really did take villains to deal with villains. That was what Zhen Yuanzi thought to himself with a secret laugh. Far away in the Western world, Jian and Junti, who had been quietly cultivating, suddenly both felt a chill in their hearts and woke from meditation. Even though they did not know exactly why, the 2 of them instinctively connected that ominous feeling to the Wu clan. When they had watched the overwhelming power and dominance of the ancestral witches during the Wu clan's establishment, and then remembered the grudge between themselves and the Wu clan, their hearts had only grown more uneasy. After a while, Junti forced a relaxed tone and said, no need to panic. As long as we act carefully, it'll be fine. If you really think about it, that whole matter was the Wu clan bullying us brothers in the first place. If it weren't for them, we never would have lost those Purple Dawn Palace seats. Things have already gone this far. Surely they can't still refuse to let it go. That would be too unreasonable.